To Refuse Such a Man, a Pride and Prejudice variation. Written by P.O. Dixon, narrated by Pearl Hewitt. Chapter 1. A Handsome Man. Netherfield's easy tranquillity vanished overnight. Instead, the house is embroiled in disquiet and unrest. Darcy silently lamented. He did not like it at all that two young ladies from a neighbouring estate had thrown themselves into their country party. As he was a guest himself, he scarcely had the right to complain. His friend Charles Bingley, who had recently let Netherfield, was happy enough over the situation for both of them. Darcy was confident the young ladies would not be there if Bingley had only listened to him and not paid so much attention to Miss Jane Bennet, the eldest of 5 daughters, all in desperate want of husbands, were he to judge by their mother's enthusiasm. The way Mrs. Bennet carried on when Bingley singled her daughter out for a second set at the Meryton Assembly less than a fortnight past appalled Darcy. His friend Bingley was always doing that sort of thing, throwing caution to the wind in the face of one angelic creature or another. This is the first time one of them has followed him home. He grimaced at this unflattering picture of the young woman. From his limited time in her company since first making her acquaintance at the Assembly, he supposed that her being at Netherfield was not her idea at all. She seemed a kind and gentle woman who was easily persuaded and whose first thought was only to satisfy other people's wishes. Surely a sensible woman would never travel on horseback during a rainstorm merely to accept a new neighbour's invitation to have tea. A sensible woman might at least take a carriage, and were such a conveyance unavailable, then she might beg to be excused from the engagement by way of a servant. As malleable as Miss Bennet seemed to be, Darcy did not think her lacking in sensibility. He was rather certain he had the young lady's mother to thank for his current anguish. He could very well imagine her spinning around the room congratulating herself on having placed her eldest daughter in such an advantageous position. Were Darcy really to question his objections to the scheme, he would confess that Miss Bennet's presence had no bearing on his composure at all. True, he did not like seeing his friend willingly ensnaring himself in a trap so easily laid as this. However, what bothered him more was the very real possibility that he, too, might fall victim to the same scheme. What could possibly have possessed her next eldest sister, Miss Elizabeth Bennet, to traipse 3 miles across the country and arrive uninvited? He thought initially upon seeing her. She had made the excuse of wishing to attend her sister's health when she was shown into the room. Who does she think she is? A nurse? Darcy silently questioned himself. Did you see her petticoat 6 inches deep in mud? The piercing voice had interrupted Darcy's musings and caused the tiny hairs on the back of his neck to stand. Looking up, he saw Charles's youngest sister, Miss Caroline Bingley, heading his way. She was just as surprised when Miss Elizabeth waltzed into the breakfast parlour little more than half an hour earlier as he was, although for very different reasons. Caroline professed an ardent dislike of the young woman, whose country manners offended her sensibilities and her notion of how a proper young lady ought to behave. Darcy, on the other hand, had never been more fascinated. Miss Elizabeth's eyes, brightened by the exertion of having walked all the way from her father's estate, rendered him captivated and speechless. Darcy braced himself for another round of Miss Bingley's protests at Miss Elizabeth's expense. Elizabeth picked up the moist cloth purposely placed on the bedside table and dabbed her sister's forehead. Heat radiated from her sister's skin. Poor Jane! She should never have been forced to travel all that way on horseback in the pounding rain. I should have insisted that Papa make the carriage available, Elizabeth silently lamented. Making matters worse, Her mamma had made light of Jane's current malady by saying that one did not die of a trifling cold. Elizabeth was in possession of a letter a servant from Netherfield had delivered to Longbourn that morning, which spoke to the gravity of her sister's illness. Elizabeth by now could recite each word. "My dearest Lizzie, I find myself very unwell this morning, which I suppose is to be imputed to my getting wet through yesterday. My kind friends will not hear of my returning till I am better. They also insist on my seeing Mr. Jones. Therefore, do not be alarmed if you should hear of his having been to me. Except for a sore throat and headache, there is not much the matter with me. No doubt Mamma is very pleased with herself," Elizabeth whispered. Stirring, Jane opened her eyes. "Dearest Lizzie, you came." "Of course I came. Nothing would have prevented my being here. Not even Mamma's protests that my coming here might be the means of ruining her matchmaking scheme," Elizabeth thought, but did not say. Jane attempted to sit up in bed. Elizabeth gently coaxed her to continue resting comfortably. "The Bingleys must think me terribly foolish to have come here amid the pouring rain." Jane had to know better. Of all the Bennet daughters, she was regarded as the most beautiful. Little wonder that she had been singled out by the agreeable Mr. Bingley as the object of his affections from the moment he laid eyes on her at the Meryton Assembly. "I dare say Mr. Bingley is very pleased to have you here. Is his opinion not the only one that actually matters?" Elizabeth asked, adjusting Jane's bedcovers. "At the risk of sounding like Mamma, I would add that the gentleman is half in love with you already." The thought that she would ever voice her mother's sentiment aloud, even jokingly, gave her pause. Being in the company of people so wholly unconnected with them, and whose acquaintance they had made little over a fortnight past, surely must be perceived as impertinence. Elizabeth's next statement was a trial. "Now you must rest, and I shall join the others. I shall return to your side later this afternoon." The idea that she might not be welcomed did not escape Elizabeth. "Mr. Bingley may not object to my intrusion, but how might his family feel?" His sister, Mrs. Louisa Hurst, and her husband, Mr. Hurst. The former's face reflected her dismay, and the latter did not even glance up from his heavily laden plate when the butler showed Elizabeth into the room earlier. In addition, the annoyance that marred Miss Caroline Bingley's countenance was something that had not escaped Elizabeth's notice. Elizabeth recalled the day the Bingley sisters called at Longbourn. Although they were generally dismissive of everyone, they showed a decided preference for Jane, which gave Elizabeth some assurance that at least her dearest sister was not a recipient of their collective disdain. Finally, there was the sour expression on Mr. Darcy's face. Unlike Mr. Hurst, Mr. Darcy did look at her. He was always looking at her, but never with the goal of seeking pleasure. If she were to judge by his unflattering assessment of her during the Meryton Assembly when his friend Bingley tried cajoling him to request her hand for a set, he looked at her merely to find fault. "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me, and I am in no humour at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men." Elizabeth had never been thus insulted in all her life. She had immediately confided in others what he had said, attempting to make light of his offence. Laughing at the ridiculousness of others was in her nature. In truth, his words had wounded her vanity more than a little, and had formed the basis for her subsequent disapprobation of the proud man. Some days later, Darcy and Miss Bingley were walking together in the shrubbery. She said, "When you and Miss Eliza are married, I hope you will give your mother-in-law a few hints on the advantage of holding her tongue." She often tried to provoke Darcy into disliking Elizabeth by talking of their supposed marriage and planning his happiness in such an alliance. "Have you anything else to propose for my domestic felicity?" "Indeed I do. If I may mention so delicate a subject, pray endeavour to check that little something bordering on conceit and impertinence that your lady possesses." At that moment, Mrs. Hurst and Elizabeth met Darcy and Miss Bingley, who were approaching from another walk. Concerned that they may have been overheard, Miss Bingley coloured. "Louisa, Miss Eliza, I did not know that you intended to walk." "Nor was I aware that the two of you intended to walk, else I should have joined you instead. Miss Elizabeth is such an excellent walker, you see. I am rather certain my presence merely serves to hinder her enjoyment on such a fine day as this." Mrs. Hurst immediately seized Mr. Darcy's disengaged arm, leaving Elizabeth to walk by herself. Mr. Darcy felt their rudeness. He wanted no part of it. He freed himself from both ladies' grips. "If I know anything about the two of you, then you will no doubt have secret affairs you wish to discuss, which my presence among your intimate party would only impede." He stepped closer to Elizabeth. "Miss Bennet, may I prevail on you to walk with me, thus affording these ladies a bit of privacy? There is a lovely prospect from the lane leading to the garden that I think you will enjoy." Darcy immediately sensed the danger of what he had done. As much as he wished to deny it, he enjoyed spending time in Elizabeth's company. Standing so close, the scent of her enthralled him, an enticing hint of soft rose petals. He dared not allow her to discover his increasing esteem, however, for it would not do to swell her expectations. Elizabeth was taken aback by his request, but the look on Miss Bingley's face compelled her to go along with Mr. Darcy's scheme for no other reason than to annoy the other woman. Linking her arm through his proffered arm, she and Darcy struck out on a different path. She was certain the gentleman and she would be parted as soon as they were beyond the view of the others. However, they did not go their separate ways, and nearly 5 minutes had passed, and there had been no conversation between them. Louisa Hurst had spoken the truth in decrying that Elizabeth was an excellent walker. Nothing pleased her more than solitary rambles. The fresh outdoor air was to be a balm to her battered spirits, as a consequence of being for so long in the company of people she did not particularly like, save Mr. Bingley. She resolved she would walk later. When she could, Elizabeth stole a sidelong glance at her taciturn walking companion. A strange fluttering in her stomach returned, one she was teaching herself to associate with being near him. She would be lying if she denied he was indeed a handsome man, with his dark mane and sideburns, that she was certain would be soft to the touch, his eyes as brooding as the sea, his chiselled chin, and his aristocratic air. Almost everyone at the Meryton Assembly had remarked on his good looks upon first seeing him. His excessive pride, however, had rendered him wanting. Little does he care what people think of him, I suspect. Jane affirms that he is merely shy. She always endeavours to see the good in everyone. I contend that he does not give himself the trouble of engaging with anyone he deems beneath him. Why the haughty man seemed perfectly contented trudging along beside her was a matter that confounded Elizabeth exceedingly. What a perplexing man! That evening, Jane was much recovered, enough to leave the room for a few hours. This news met with Elizabeth's satisfaction, for she did not know how well she might bear another night in the company of the pernicious Bingley sisters, the slovenly Mr. Hurst, and the brooding Mr. Darcy. Standing behind her sister, helping arrange her hair, Elizabeth smiled at her sister's reflection. "I do not know which of us is more pleased that you will be joining us this evening, my dearest Jane, Mr. Bingley or me." "Oh, Lizzie, you have been a real angel through all of this. I know what a sacrifice it has been on your part to be away from Longbourn for so very long." "I dare not argue with you." Catching her sister's eyes in the mirror, Jane said, "Let us get through this evening. Tomorrow we shall send word to Mamma to beg that the carriage might be sent for us in the course of the day." "Nothing would please me more. However, you and I both know Mamma too well to suppose that such a request will be received with pleasure." Elizabeth then recalled her mamma's parting remarks the day before when she came to Netherfield with Kitty and Lydia to check on Jane's recovery. She meant for them to stay there until Jane had secured a marriage proposal. She had gone so far as to share her scheme with Elizabeth while taking her leave of Netherfield. Her mother meant to whisper, Elizabeth was sure. However, her mother's whispers were not to be compared to the whispers of someone whose spirits were less animated. Her proclamation while standing outside the awaiting carriage was not meant to be vulgar, but that is exactly what it was. "Remember what I said. You must keep your sister here as long as you can, Lizzie. I mean for there to be a wedding between our dearest Jane and Mr. Bingley as soon as can be." She was still talking while a footman handed her into the carriage. "We shall see what Lady Lucas thinks about that." Elizabeth shuddered, merely recalling her mother's words. "Pray you are not succumbing to my illness," cried Jane, her eyes filled with concern. "Perish the thought, my dearest Jane. No, I am perfectly well. I simply recalled something my mother said about her plans for your future. Is it anything I ought to know before we go down to sit with the others?" "Oh, Jane, please trust me when I say that you do not want to know what Mamma has in store." Chapter 2. Sign of Admiration. Tomorrow cannot come soon enough, Elizabeth thought. Such was her impatience to be away from Netherfield. Whatever affection Miss Bingley may have felt for Jane was insufficient to mask her increasing disdain in having Elizabeth there, and she did not attempt to hide it. Days of being on the receiving end of the lady's disapprobation had gone from being rather amusing to utterly tiring. Such cattiness as that which she observed in Miss Bingley was new to Elizabeth. It all had to do with the young woman's jealousy that Elizabeth was a competitor for Mr. Darcy's affection. How ridiculous! Mr. Darcy did indeed show Elizabeth more attention than she expected since she had been there. She tore her eyes from the unread pages of her book and gazed out the window. Her mind wandered to his taunting her about desiring to dance one evening, and how his reaction to her put-down was met with more pleasure than offence. After playing some Italian songs, Miss Bingley had varied the charm by a lively Scotch air. This encouraged Mr. Darcy, whose eyes had been fixed on Elizabeth, to draw near and ask if she felt a great inclination to seize the opportunity of dancing a reel. She knew enough about this man to know that he never danced unless he could help it. The idea that she might say yes solely for the purpose of thwarting his desire to mock her crossed her mind, but cheating him of his premeditated concept was far more appealing. She told him as much. Concluding her speech, she said, "I have therefore made up my mind to tell you that I do not want to dance a reel at all. Now despise me if you dare." "Indeed, I do not dare," he had replied. Having rather expected to affront him, Elizabeth had been amazed at his gallantry. His behaviour today will surely confirm he was acting to discourage Miss Bingley's attentions. Left by themselves by the rest of the Netherfield party, they had been sitting there for half an hour, and not once did he look at her. Does he truly mean to say nothing to me, to pretend I am not in the room? Elizabeth thought some conversation ought to be had. She found it puzzling that a man who spent as much time as this one did looking at her could find absolutely nothing to say. They might discuss the weather. Elizabeth was certain that, were he to apply himself, he might make even the dullest threadbare conversation tolerable. I might ask him about the weather in Derbyshire. I am sure that it is quite unlike the weather here in Hertfordshire, especially during late autumn. On the other hand, I had better not. I can well imagine that he would consider it just the sort of thing the other women he knows would discuss. Women the likes of Miss Bingley, who are always saying and doing things solely for his approbation. That would never do. The last thing I want is for Mr. Darcy to think I am the sort of woman who seeks to garner his favour. In fact, I am not at all convinced I want him thinking of me at all. Discussion of the weather being off limits as a means of cutting through the uncomfortable silence, she looked around the library. Bingley was right when he said that it was sparse. Her father's library was far more substantial. Perhaps in time Bingley will amend this lapse that has resulted in such a paltry state of his library. Surely he has the means. Her thoughts went to her sister. Perhaps when Jane is mistress, she will be the one to oversee such an endeavour. A baffling feeling washed over her. Yet again I find myself thinking similarly to my mamma. She arched her brow in silent amusement. Heaven forbid I should adopt all of mamma's habits. She then recalled her mother and Darcy's verbal standoff. She felt compelled to intervene on the gentleman's behalf before her mother said something that would be really embarrassing in front of them all, and perhaps hamper Jane's prospects. Elizabeth supposed that Mr. Darcy took such prodigious care of Mr. Bingley that one word from him would poison Bingley's regard for all the Bennets, including Jane. That would never ever do. She began to think of other things she might say to draw him out. Perhaps I ought to remark on the size of the room, or the number of fine books. Then I might ask him about his favourite books. There were any number of things they might discuss, were they of a mind to do it. She then began to consider that the fitting thing to do would be to return his cool incivility with incivility of her own. Why risk speaking to him and having him think I actually like him? Darcy welcomed the intelligence that the Longbourn party was soon to return to where they had come from. Elizabeth had been at Netherfield long enough. She attracted him more than he liked. Also, his unguarded attentions to her had caused Miss Bingley to be uncivil to her, and to tease him more than usual. He wisely resolved to be particularly careful that no sign of admiration should now escape him, nothing that could elevate her with the hope of influencing his felicity. If indeed such an idea had been suggested, his behaviour during that particular day would surely be the means of confirming or crushing it. Thoughts of how the two of them had engaged in heated debates over the past several days crept into his mind. It was all he could do to keep himself from smiling. She possessed a mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner, making it difficult for her to affront anybody. Having at first scarcely allowed her to be pretty, he had looked at her without admiration at the Meryton assembly. When next they met, he looked at her only to criticize. However, no sooner had he made it clear to himself and his friends that she hardly had a good feature in her face than he began to find it was rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. To this discovery succeeded some others equally mortifying. Though he had detected with a critical eye more than one failure of perfect symmetry in her form, he was forced to acknowledge her figure to be light and pleasing. And in spite of his asserting that her manners were not those of the fashionable world, he was caught by their easy playfulness. I have never been so bewitched by any woman as I am by her. Achingly aware of her, thoughts that no gentleman ought to entertain in the presence of a gentlewoman crept into his mind as he began to feel the danger of being in such proximity to Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Darcy had but one purpose in being in Hertfordshire, to help his friend Charles Bingley in navigating the tricky waters of being the master of his own estate. The last thing he expected was to meet the woman whose nearness caused him to entertain ideas of what it would be like to know her as his wife. At 27, Darcy had managed to avoid any entanglement that might give rise to an expectation of marriage. At first, it might be said that he took some comfort in the presumption that those who knew him best held that he would marry his cousin, Miss Anne de Bourgh. However, when Anne herself began to entertain such notions, Darcy put an end to that by declaring to anyone who dared ask that such a union would never be. Anne took the information as well as could be expected. However, the same could not be said of her mother, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. The older sister of his late mother, Lady Catherine insisted that it was the favourite wish of her sister that the two young people should be married. "Anne and Darcy were fashioned for each other at birth," she always pontificated. Even Darcy's own words to the contrary were insufficient to douse her hopes that such a union would one day unfold. Oh, what a determined advocate Lady Catherine could be when she put her mind to it. Satisfied in the knowledge that his aunt's wishes were not and would never be his own, Darcy simply pretended not to hear a word she spoke about his future marital prospects. He took his responsibilities as a landlord, a master of hundreds, and an older brother and co-guardian of his younger sister, Miss Georgiana Darcy, quite seriously. Among those responsibilities was choosing the next mistress of Pemberley wisely. The next thing he knew, the thought of how Miss Elizabeth Bennet would be received in London crossed his mind. Darcy could hardly fathom why he would be picturing Miss Elizabeth travelling in his sphere in town. Then again, there were places in town where tradesmen of means cavorted with the tone: the park, the shops, and the theatre. He then began to wonder if, indeed, they had frequented some of the same places. Her only connection in London that he was aware of was the uncle who resided in Cheapside. Surely, if there were other, more consequential connections, she or her mother would have said something. Speaking of her mother, there was a woman who he barely tolerated. His intercourse with Mrs. Bennet had been marred by contentiousness. When he rightly pointed out how the company in town was far more varied than in such a small place as Meryton, she took umbrage, insisting that they regularly dined with 24 families. As insignificant a number as that was compared to the society he was referring to, he did not see how it could even be that high. Arguing with the woman was hardly something he wanted to do. I have done quite enough of that with her beguiling daughter since her arrival. He had gone out of his way to converse with her, which was quite uncharacteristic for a man like him. Even Miss Bingley had discerned his unguarded attention to Miss Elizabeth. He was sure that was the catalyst for her barbs and snide remarks. As flattering as it might seem, having women compete over him was not something he particularly cared for. Of course, in this case he needed not worry at all. If Miss Elizabeth were never to show a preference for him, Miss Bingley's estimation in his eyes would not increase one jot. She had neither the wit nor the charm of Miss Elizabeth, whose beauty Darcy was failing miserably to withstand, especially at night, when her light and pleasing figure crept into his dreams. Indeed, remaining a silent companion is the best thing to do. Elizabeth, for her part, could not deny that the silence had its advantages, for it gave her the chance to reflect upon her time at Netherfield. More precisely, the actual reason for her being there. It is my mother's duty to make matches for my sisters and me. I begin to suspect that any man would do, even one as proud as Mr. Darcy. Until this day she expresses her grief over her inability to make a match for Jane when she had been so close. A fine young gentleman from town who wrote Jane some lovely poetry sprang to mind. That was some time ago. Several years had passed, and Mrs. Bennet continued to lament the loss of such a delightful young man as a future son-in-law. Elizabeth surmised that Mrs. Bennet would stop at nothing to see Jane become mistress of all this. Looking about the room, she thought to herself, certainly no one is more deserving than Jane to be mistress of Netherfield. As for her own prospects, Elizabeth rarely thought of such things, although she supposed she ought to make a start. With 3 younger sisters and all of them out, she too felt the burden of finding a husband. Their prospects were few, and despite Jane being reported as the most beautiful and Elizabeth being known as the jewel of the country, Elizabeth owed their diminished chances to their lack of fortune. Mr. Darcy's harsh words resonated in her ears. It must very materially lessen their chance of marrying men of any consideration in the world. Had he known she was standing just outside the door that day, poised to enter the room, he likely would have kept his opinion on the matter to himself. As harsh as his dire prognostication for her marital prospects were, she could not find it in herself to be angry with him. For what would have been the point in being angry with someone who merely spoke the truth? Another thought came to mind. That is all the more reason that all of my family should be rejoicing in Mr. Bingley's preference towards Jane. He is kind and handsome and amiable, or, in Jane's own words, everything a gentleman ought to be. The fact that he is rich is more of a bonus. Such thoughts as these increased Elizabeth's desire to be once again by Jane's side. Between Darcy and Elizabeth, there was a greater sense of relief from the latter as she closed her book, laid it aside, stood, and quit the room. Neither of them could have known that their time alone in Netherfield's library had not gone unnoticed. When at last the day of their long-sought departure from Netherfield arrived, the liveliness of spirits she had expected to enjoy was replaced with great astonishment. Hastening her steps down the spiralling staircase, Elizabeth nearly stumbled and fell. She caught herself, but not soon enough for Mr. Bingley to remain unaffected. "You must be careful, Miss Elizabeth, or you shall find yourself a guest at Netherfield even longer. Not that I would mind, for you and your sister are perfectly welcome to stay here as long as you like." He must have realized how untoward he sounded. He swallowed hard and turned to his friend. "What say you, Darcy?" His rich baritone voice determined, Darcy replied, "I am sure the ladies are eager to return to their own home, Bingley." His words had been directed to his friend, but his eyes had been fixed on Elizabeth's. "Of course you are correct, my friend." Bingley looked at Jane and smiled. "Miss Bennet?" Next he looked at Elizabeth. "Miss Elizabeth, I can honestly say I have enjoyed having you ladies here as much as your family missed having you at Longbourn. I shall look forward to both of you returning for the ball." Ah, the much-anticipated ball. Elizabeth could not believe her youngest sister Lydia had instigated such a thing by taxing Mr. Bingley with having promised on his first coming into the county to give a ball at Netherfield. Bingley's eager agreement was even more of a testament to his increasing regard for Jane. Elizabeth was certain of it. As was to be expected, Bingley extended his arm to Jane and commenced walking with her outside to the awaiting carriage. Elizabeth's astonishment was great when Mr. Darcy approached her side and extended his arm. "Does he mean to escort me?" Apparently he did. Although startled, she did what any well-bred woman would do in such circumstances. She accepted his proffered arm, and along with the gentleman, fell in step behind Jane and Mr. Bingley. When Elizabeth and Jane were settled next to each other in the carriage, it slowly pulled away. The gentleman who had so graciously escorted them to the carriage remained standing there still, likely waiting for it to pass beyond their sight, each with decidedly different emotions. Jane was no doubt pleased to be escorted by a man she held in such high esteem. Elizabeth, on the other hand, did not know what to make of her former companion. She awoke that morning with the distinct impression that he barely tolerated her, as evidenced by his taciturn behaviour in the library the day before. Had he awakened with the notion of somehow admiring her, or was he in such a rush to have her banished from his company, and thus went out of his way to see that she was gone? Turning her face upward to welcome the sun's warm caress, Elizabeth released a sigh. Oh, perplexing man! Chapter 3. Her neighbours. The evening of the Netherfield ball was upon them. Elizabeth prepared for the event with more than the usual care. Having spent the past several days confined indoors owing to an abundance of rain, she was eager for a change. She had been so unfortunate as to have missed attending a recent dinner party at the home of her aunt, Mrs. Phillips, who resided in Meryton. Her younger sisters described the occasion as one of the happiest days of their lives, for they had been ever so fortunate as to have made the acquaintance of a Mr. George Wickham. By her sister's eager accounts, Elizabeth surmised the gentleman's appearance was greatly in his favour. The girls eagerly proclaimed that he had all the best parts of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and a very pleasing address. What young woman would not be excited by the prospect of meeting such a gentleman? This idea of making the acquaintance of the newest addition to their society is what gave her the strength to endure what would be a rather tiresome evening, should her ridiculous cousin Mr. Collins, whom she had recently met, make good on his promise to stay close by her side. Indeed, Elizabeth persuaded herself that Mr. William Collins was not a sensible man. Wanting to clear himself from the guilt of inheriting Longbourn upon her father's death as soon as he may wish to, he had come to Meryton desirous of choosing a wife from among the Bennet daughters. To her dismay, the odious man apparently had singled her out as the object of his fondest regard. Elizabeth was not formed for ill humour. She certainly did not intend for her cousin to destroy her prospects for the evening, despite being obliged to stand across from him for the first 2 dances. What ecstasy she suffered when she was released from him, and thus at liberty to dance with more agreeable partners, the first being an officer. His manner was gentlemanly, and his conversation was delightful, especially given that it afforded her a chance to learn more about the elusive Mr. Wickham. Hearing that he was universally liked by all increased her desire to meet him, and she hoped he would soon arrive so that she might enjoy such a pleasure. Later, while she was standing with her intimate friend, Miss Charlotte Lucas, from a neighbouring estate, Elizabeth was taken by surprise when Mr. Darcy approached her. He asked if she would grant him the honour of the next dance. Having received a favourable reply, he walked away as suddenly as he arrived, leaving Elizabeth confounded. She had only seen the perplexing man once since the day he escorted her to the carriage at Netherfield. That had been during a chance encounter in town when he barely acknowledged her. She quickly surmised that the absence of a certain Bingley sister meant he had no reason to make a pretence of admiring her on that particular day. Remembering the pleasing, albeit puzzling sensations that accompanied his touch, she secretly wished that was not the case. Even his pretensions were preferable to the attentions of her ridiculous cousin. Recalling herself to the present, she smiled. No doubt he will do a fine job of pretending to admire me when the dancing recommences, solely for Miss Bingley's sake, of course, she reminded herself. What was the point in denying his attraction to Miss Elizabeth any longer? The memory of the touch of his hand upon hers when he assisted her into the carriage that day lingered still, stirring his passion and finding him wishing for something more. He would soon be gone away from Hertfordshire. He had admired her too much not to carry the memory of having danced with her at least once. Thus resolved, Darcy had made his way to the part of the room where Elizabeth stood with her friend, Miss Charlotte Lucas, and applied for the next set. Now standing opposite her, Darcy was at a complete loss for what to say. The idea of performing to strangers was one he abhorred, yet he was not unaware of her neighbours and their manner of looking at him standing opposite her, their hushed whispers which no doubt spoke to their amazement that he had singled her out from among all the other young ladies in attendance. He heard her make some remark on the dance, to which he replied, but then he was again silent. Having satisfied herself with the knowledge that she had done her part to converse with the taciturn man, she was content to go through the rest of the dance in silence. Her mind was now elsewhere. Elizabeth was looking for evidence that the dashing Mr. Wickham, who had garnered so much approbation from all around, had arrived. Regrettably, she did not detect a single gentleman in the gathering whose acquaintance she had not already made. "Are you looking for someone, Miss Elizabeth?" "No," she replied rather hastily. She half smiled. "I was rather admiring the size of the room and the number of couples." Darcy returned the cordial gesture, heightening his handsome features, but said nothing. As a means of making amends for her inattentiveness, she said, "My sister tells me that Mr. Bingley shall return to London on matters of business in the morning, sir. I wonder whether you will be taking your leave as well." "I hope that is not your way of saying that I have overstayed my welcome here in Hertfordshire." "That is not for me to say, sir." Biting his lower lip as a means of holding his tongue, Darcy's curiosity won out. "That gentleman who was standing with you earlier shows a decidedly devoted interest in you." Here they were parted by the dance, and when they were reunited he continued, "I am aware that he is the heir to your father's estate." "Mr. Darcy, forgive me, but discussing Mr. Collins is the last thing I wish to do." "What do you think of books?" said he, obliging her obvious desire to change the subject. "How interesting that you wish to discuss such matters now, Mr. Darcy. The topic of books might easily have been discussed when we were in the library." Thoughts of that day leapt into his mind. Indeed, they were surrounded by books. However, the last thing on his mind were thoughts that did not centre on her light and pleasing figure, the faint scent of her perfume, and the manner in which she twisted locks of her dark hair around her fingers when she was reading. What's more, there were thoughts that were no more appropriate now as they were then. How thoroughly he had gotten to know every inch of her body over the past weeks, even if only in his dreams. Intoxicating, passion-filled dreams that he ought not to have about a gentleman's daughter. Dreams that started long before the two of them found themselves sleeping under the same roof, quiet footsteps apart. Endeavouring to relegate such thoughts to the back of his mind, he said, "Surely we must have some conversation." "Sir, I do not know that we must. Miss Bingley is nowhere in the immediate vicinity." "Miss Bingley? I have to ask you why you would mention her at such a time as this." "I have always considered myself a fair studier of people. No doubt she is a woman who is quite enamoured of you. Do you pretend to be ignorant of this?" "I do not." "Then do you pretend that you have not used me as a pawn in your scheme to frustrate the lady's hopes?" The cutting effect of her accusation was immediate. A deeper shade of hauteur overspread his features. They were parted by the dance once more, giving both of them a much-needed reprieve. When they were joined again, his expression was changed. "Miss Elizabeth," he began, "you have sadly mistaken my character if you believe such a representation to be well-founded." "Then perhaps you'll enlighten me, sir. How else do you explain your changeable moods?" "In what regard?" "The only thing I can honestly speak to is your well-timed want of flattering me with attention when in the young lady's company, and then acting as though I do not exist when she is not present." "I can only beg your forgiveness, Miss Elizabeth, if that is indeed the impression that I have given you. The truth is, you impress me like no other woman I've ever known." He wanted to say more, but his character prohibited him. Soon enough he would be away from Hertfordshire, perhaps forever. The two of them might never see each other again. Even if their imminent parting unsettled him, he knew it was better that way. Thus resolved, he said no more. His words astounded her. What could possibly have been his purpose in making such a declaration? Elizabeth might have said something in reply had he given her a bit of encouragement. As he did not, she contented herself to follow his lead. Moments later, the dance ended. They had not long separated when Miss Bingley hurried towards Mr. Darcy. With an expression of unmasked distaste, she said, "Perhaps I was too quick to ignore those nasty little rumours painting you and that Eliza Bennet in a most unflattering light." Darcy, who rarely listened to anything Miss Bingley had to say with the consideration that she felt was warranted, was somewhat taken aback by this revelation. "I am in no mood for your taunting as regards my domestic felicity with Miss Elizabeth Bennet this evening." Twisting her strands of pearls, she said, "It is not my intention to taunt you, sir. I merely mean to suggest that your singling out the young woman this evening is rather a confirmation of what's being whispered and bantered about behind closed doors regarding the two of you. If it is true that such speculation exists, then why have I heard nothing of this before? I immediately dismissed such talk as scandalous falsehoods. However, observing the two of you just now, I am forced to consider that I acted too precipitously in discharging the servant who first brought this intelligence to me. You ought to have made me aware of the situation, but instead you've made it worse by dismissing the servant. His temples throbbing, he added, "Allow me to thank you for your interference in my affairs." "I thought I was sparing you the indignity of hearing any of this," she cried. "Instead, you have made him or her desperate. Who is to say how extensive the ensuing damage will be?" Chapter 4. Worthy of the Honour. The morning after the ball, Bingley returned to London on business, as had been planned. Concerned by the angry words that passed between them the evening before, Miss Bingley suggested to Darcy that they might follow her brother to town, and thus put the entire sordid experience behind them. Not contented to rely solely upon Miss Bingley's word that his spending time alone with Elizabeth had been the means of a looming scandal, Darcy had taken it upon himself to learn the truth of the matter. He questioned the one person who made it his business to know such things, his valet, Mr. Waters. Waters did not say much, except that whenever he entered one of the rooms below stairs, a severe dropping off in conversation always ensued. To Darcy, it was enough said. Without looking up from his paper, Darcy replied, "You are at liberty to leave as soon as you wish. I, however, will not be joining you. As you very well know, I have a matter to attend to this morning that will not be put off." "You cannot be serious, Mr. Darcy. Do you pretend to be ignorant of the appalling behaviour of those Bennets last evening? True, you left before supper, but I am beginning to think you should have stayed. Then you too would have been privy to the dreadful manner in which Mrs. Bennet boasted aloud that there would be a wedding at Netherfield Park in 3 months. Thank heavens my brother has returned to town. To the extent it is within my power, I shall make sure that he never returns." Darcy folded his paper and set it aside. "Miss Bingley, you are within your right to be concerned about your brother's marital prospects, but your wishes and concerns have nothing at all to do with me. I shall not allow Miss Elizabeth's reputation to suffer as a result of rumours of ungentlemanly behaviour on my part." "You would be wise to spare yourself such an indignity as aligning yourself with the likes of those Bennets. Think of what your family and friends will say. Return to town. These rumours will fade, and one day, if she is lucky, surely Eliza Bennet and her fine eyes will attract the notice of some poor unsuspecting man of no consideration in the world who is her equal." "I beg your pardon, but Miss Elizabeth is a gentleman's daughter. I am a gentleman. That makes the two of us very equal, would you not say? Unlike you, I might add." Having forced him to say that which gave her no pleasure, the young lady cried, "Mr. Darcy!" "What have I said that is untrue?" "It may be true that she is a gentleman's daughter. What does that mean in the eyes of the world, when said gentleman has no fortune, no connections, and nothing to recommend himself save an estate that is entailed to the likes of that ridiculous Mr. Collins? Pray think better of what you are about, sir. Do anything but align yourself with such a family." "Your admonishments are wasted on me, Miss Bingley. I know exactly what I am about, and I know exactly what I must do." Not long after that, Darcy found himself sitting across from Mr. Thomas Bennet in Longbourn's library. His arrival had gone unnoticed by the ladies, as they were busily engaged with their ears perched against a door of one of the other rooms when the housekeeper ushered Darcy right past them on the way to the library. He did not fail to notice that the object of his being there was not among the indecorous group. He surmised that she was out and about on one of her solitary rambles. The question of whether she would continue such pursuits when he brought her to Pemberley entered his mind, but he supposed he was getting a little ahead of himself. The news that Darcy conveyed to Mr. Bennet that his favourite daughter was fodder for malicious gossip, and how he was fully prepared to stand by her side, was received about as well as Darcy had expected. Silent and grave, the older man said, "I take no pleasure in entertaining a request such as this, one that surely would never have been made were it not for the threat of scandal." "Sir, your sentiments are perfectly understandable. You want your daughter to marry a man she can respect, a man who cares for her above all others. I will be that man. I admire your daughter already, much more than even she is aware. I value her." Mr. Bennet said, "I do not doubt that you would appreciate my daughter. She is charming and witty, and every bit deserving of her reputation as being the brightest jewel of the country. But what of her family?" "I dare say that there are members of my own family that I find objectionable." "Then you admit to finding the Bennets objectionable, yet you expect me to congratulate myself on my daughter's behalf that you have condescended to request her hand in marriage." "Sir, what I am saying is that I will afford my wife's family all due deference, and I shall endeavour to treat them with no less consideration than I afford my own." An odd mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humour, reserve, and caprice, Mr. Bennet could not help being impressed that the younger man was making a concerted effort to say all the right things. He began to consider that Mr. Darcy was a decent man, in spite of what others might think. After all, he could have absconded to town or even Derbyshire the instant he was made aware of the rumours, and yet he had chosen to do the honourable and decent thing. Standing and thus encouraging Darcy to do likewise, Mr. Bennet offered the younger man his hand. "You, sir, have my permission to speak with my daughter, and, should she agree to your petition, the two of you shall have my hearty consent." Elizabeth stood there. She did not know where to look or even how to look. Never in her life had she expected her first proposal of marriage to be extended in such an appalling manner by such an appalling man. Here, standing before me, is the last man in the world I could ever be prevailed on to marry, and yet he has the audacity to stand here with every expectation of a favourable reply. His talk of forever holding his tongue on the matter of her lack of fortune annoyed her beyond measure. Who does he think he is? "Sir, if I may be allowed to speak." Her plea fell on deaf ears. He would not cease his dreadful proposal. He felt it necessary to explain why he was offering his hand. What did she care? He proceeded to congratulate Elizabeth on her good sensibility. He was confident she would measure up to the high standards befitting the woman who would soon be the mistress of his home, the mother of his children. It was absolutely necessary to interrupt him now. "You are too hasty, sir," she cried. "You forget that I have made no answer. Let me do so without further loss of time. Accept my thanks for the compliment you are paying me. However, hear me when I say, Mr. Collins, that I will not marry you. My conscience, my sense of right and wrong, and everything that I am forbids me such an alliance." "I am not unaware," replied Mr. Collins, "that it is usual for young ladies to reject the addresses of the man whom they secretly mean to accept when he first applies for their favour. There is the general expectation that the refusal is repeated a second or even a third time. I am therefore by no means discouraged by what you have just said, and shall hope to lead you to the altar before long." "Upon my word, sir," exclaimed Elizabeth, "your hope is a rather extraordinary one after my declaration. I assure you that I am not one of those young ladies who are so daring as to risk their happiness on the chance of being asked the second time. I am perfectly serious in my refusal."
Nothing would persuade me to accept your offer, for it was not long after I met you, sir, that your obsequious manner impressed upon me that you are indeed the last man in the world I would wish to marry."
His expression retained that same air of expectation that she was merely prolonging his suspense, and therefore encouraged her to say more.
"Sir, I have not met your esteemed patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. If a modicum of what you have said about her is true, I can honestly say that I never wished to meet her. If it is indeed your intention to choose a wife who will meet with that woman's approval, then you have made a grave error in selecting me as your future wife. Indeed, you ought to be thanking me for rejecting your hand."
"There must be some kind of mistake. Your mother has assured me that you would be eager to accept my proposal, especially as you were not even my first choice. Indeed, your sister Jane is the Bennet daughter I immediately considered worthy of the honour I meant to bestow subsequent to my arrival in Hertfordshire."
"What are you saying, sir?"
"I am saying that, despite what your mother said, your eldest sister is no closer to receiving an offer of marriage from Mr. Charles Bingley today than she was when I first singled her out as the object of my affections. There is no reason to suppose that she would not be just as willing to entertain a proposal from me as she would from him. Perhaps I am speaking with the wrong Bennet daughter."
Elizabeth coloured. Heaven forbid that the odious man should retract his proposal and offer for Jane out of spite. As well as she knew her sister, she considered that Jane did not deserve such a fate. Oh, if only Mr. Bingley had offered for Jane by now, then Elizabeth would not have cause to temper her stance. "Sir, I believe I have spoken too hastily. What I meant to say is that, well, your proposal took me quite by surprise. I never once suspected that a man like you could ever possibly be interested in a woman like me, given that Jane truly is the beauty in the family. I am not insensitive of the honour of your proposal." She then heard herself uttering, "I suppose what I mean to say is that I should like time to consider the merits of your offer before I give you my final answer." The proud man dusted imaginary lint from his sleeve, and then gave his waistcoat a firm tug.
"I knew you could be prevailed upon to be reasonable. As a sign of my affection for you, I shall allow you additional time to think better of what you are about."
Mrs. Bennet nearly fell inside the room when Collins opened the door.
"Mrs. Bennet!"
A woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper, who had once known her fair share of beauty, Mrs. Bennet cried, "Oh, Mr. Collins, my dearest Lizzie, am I to wish the two of you joy? Oh, of course I am." She looked at the gentleman. "Did I not tell you that my Lizzie was a sensible girl, Mr. Collins? Oh, she shall make an excellent wife." Mr. Collins said,
"I would ask you to defer your good wishes, at least for the remainder of the day. Your daughter has asked for time to consider my proposal, and I have indeed agreed to her request."
The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Her astonishment she did not repress. "Lizzie, you foolish child! What is there to think about?"
"My dear Mrs. Bennet," Collins said, holding up his hand, "I am happy to allow your second eldest daughter this additional time. For once she and I are man and wife, it will be my mission to see to it that she is happy. I will gladly wait a while longer before she makes me the most fortunate man in the world, for I have no doubt that she and I have established a proper understanding." When she laid her head on her pillow to rest during the wee hours of that morning, she never could have imagined she would be pondering such weighty matters that day. Indeed, Elizabeth had much to consider. She would do anything for her sister Jane, even throw away her own chance for Felicity to see Jane happy. Elizabeth had a thought. What if she could speak to Jane and obtain her assurance that she would not accept Mr. Collins should he make her an offer? She knew herself well enough to say that she could tolerate her mother's ire. But as for Jane's ability to endure her mother's disapprobation, Elizabeth was rather less confident. She paced the garden path.
The warm autumn sun on her face was doing its best to chase away her melancholy, all in vain. That odious man who called himself a parson had effectively blackmailed her into considering his proposal by summoning her dearest sister's name. She racked her brain for some means of escaping what she was certain would be a most unwelcome prospect for herself as well as her sister. Could she put her cousin off until Mr. Bingley returned? What if he never returns? What if he returns and still does not make Jane an offer of marriage? The sound of a gentleman clearing his throat interrupted Elizabeth's silent deliberations. She covered her face with both hands and exhaled a pained breath. My life as I know it is over. Nevertheless, she knew what she must do. Dropping her hands, she turned, fully prepared to accept her sentence. There he stood, his countenance handsome and his eyes questioning, the exact opposite of the man she had been expecting, nay dreading, to see in that instance. Mr. Darcy? Miss Elizabeth, I have been walking about the garden for some time, hoping for a private audience with you. Mr. Darcy! There is something important I must say to you. I have already spoken with your father, and I have obtained his permission to speak with you. You see, a matter of the utmost concern was brought to my attention last evening. One that involves you. He now stood directly before her. Elizabeth studied the gentleman in silence. Gone was the man whose cultivated aloofness typically defined his countenance. In his place was a man whose eyes bore uncertainty, his voice tenderness. I know what I am about to say to you might seem rather untoward, but decades from now, when you look back at this moment, my greatest wish is that you will remember it fondly. Mr. Darcy? Miss Elizabeth, I admire you most ardently. Will you please do me the honour of accepting my hand? Astounded, Elizabeth coloured. She stared. Although rendered speechless by his avowal, her mind raced as 1,000 thoughts competed for their share of attention. One pounded more forcefully than the rest. Even if there was no proposal from Mr. Collins threatening to destroy her every prospect for felicity, how might she reasonably deny such a petition from a man of Mr. Darcy's consequence? For a woman of my circumstances to refuse such a man were it made known would undoubtedly render me imprudent, selfish, and heedless of the greater good of my family. How was it even possible that such a man was in her power and she did not know it? Not once had she sought his approbation, and yet somehow she had managed to secure it to her greatest advantage. Even now she was not certain she wanted it. Still, she could not be insensible to the compliment of such a man's affection. Finding her voice, she said, Sir, in such cases as this, it is, I believe, the established mode to express a sense of obligation for the sentiments avowed. However, Darcy's countenance reflected his disbelief. Are you rejecting me? Chapter 5. Such a request. No, sir, I am not, Elizabeth responded tentatively, pondering the import of her next reply. His gaze intent, Darcy said, Then you are accepting me? I suppose, sir, what I mean to say is I never expected an offer of marriage from you. I need time to consider. You said you have spoken with my father. I suppose I ought to talk to him as well. Pray you will allow me that opportunity before I give you an answer. Darcy would have been surprised if Elizabeth had not made such a request. Any other woman would have pounced on the opportunity to marry a wealthy gentleman. It merely bolstered his confidence that she would be everything his wife and the mistress of his home ought to be. Agreeing that her decision to speak with her father was sensible, Darcy watched as Elizabeth walked away. The favourite of his 5 daughters, Elizabeth was not eager to make a decision that found her on the wrong side of her father's wishes. With that in mind, she walked into the library. She espied her father standing before one of the tall stacks, his hands clutched behind his back. "Papa," she said, garnering his attention. He turned. Waving her closer, he said, "Come, my child. It seems I am very popular this morning. First, I had the honour of receiving Mr. Darcy. Then your mother sought me out for an urgent matter having to do with Mr. Collins and you, and now here you are. I shall not make light of your situation, my dear. However, I would be entirely remiss were I to fail to point out that receiving 2 proposals in a single morning can be best described as a young lady's most fanciful dream come true." 2 proposals indeed, one from most every young woman's idea of Prince Charming, a man blessed with good looks, untold wealth, and a beautiful castle, and the other from a suitor quite plain and simply a toad. Elizabeth pondered the irony. "One might say it is the stuff of a fairy tale-like dream come true. However, I cannot help but consider it as more of a nightmare." Her father arched his brow. "A nightmare, you say? Pray do not allow your mother to hear you speak this way. Her mission in life is to see all her daughters well settled. Surely you would not impede her hopes in that regard." "Papa, my mother is determined that I shall marry Mr. Collins. Pray you are not of the same mind." "To see you married to such a man would surely break my heart. However, my child, I cannot say the same as regards the possibility of your marrying Mr. Darcy." "Papa, I cannot fathom why such a man would even make me an offer of marriage. You've spoken to him. What can possibly be his purpose in choosing me?"
"Did he not tell you his reasoning?"
"He only said that he had spoken with you. He did not say what you two discussed."
"Please come and have a seat, my dearest Lizzie."
Elizabeth did as she was told. She listened as her papa told her what she needed to know. When he was finished, she said, "Pray you will believe me when I say that nothing untoward took place."
"I believe you, but it is not merely my feelings that must be consulted."
He shook his head.
"Were it only that simple. As I see it, you have 3 choices before you. You might accept Mr. Collins, thus surrendering all respectability and risking misery of the acutest kind."
Elizabeth could tell by the anguish that washed over her father's face how much it would pain him were she to choose such a path.
Mr. Bennet continued, "You might accept Mr. Darcy, and thereby have a chance for happiness, or you might reject both gentlemen. True, there may be a scandal, on the other hand there may not. Who is to say how fickle society may be when it comes to such matters? One thing is certain. Your loving mother will subject you to misery far more unbearable than 1,000 scandals. How you decide to spend the rest of your days is entirely up to you."
A quarter of an hour later, Elizabeth was alone in the library, staring out the window. The view of how things now stood was not entirely bad. Mr. Darcy's proposal had effectively rendered her cousin's offer inconsequential, for if she were to marry Mr. Darcy, her mother and sisters would be saved. Jane would have no reason to entertain the idea of marrying Mr. Collins. Do I truly have a choice? The idea of marrying a man she barely knew was frightening, yet that is exactly what her mother would have her do in insisting that she marry her cousin. What must it be like to marry Mr. Darcy? True, he is at times haughty and dismissive. Surely he must have some admirable qualities other than being tall, handsome, and incredibly rich. If Miss Bingley's opinion of him is to be a factor, then I must consider that there are those who liken him to one of the best men in the world. Her stomach fluttered a little. His flattering words, the lingering touch of his hand on hers, and the way he always looked at her, gave Elizabeth reason to suppose that, the threat of scandal or not, Mr. Darcy had been in her power all along.
"The truth is, you impress me like no other woman I've ever known."
Then there had been the tender manner of his proposal, his desire that when she looked back upon that moment decades from now, she would remember it fondly. Miss Elizabeth, I admire you most ardently. Will you please do me the honour of accepting my hand? Darcy was too much concerned with what Elizabeth's answer would be to return to Netherfield Park. He decided to wait at that same spot he found her. Earlier, he had seen her cousin, Mr. Collins, strolling the grounds, taking stock of things as though he were already Longbourn's master. Recalling the man dancing with Elizabeth at last evening's ball and making a fool of himself, the last thing Darcy wished to do was attract the gentleman's notice. The sight of the current master of Longbourn heading his way caused Darcy to cease his pacing. He walked towards the older man, and when they were face to face, Mr. Bennet said, "Mr. Darcy, my daughter is in the library. She is prepared to speak with you now." With Mr. Bennet's assistance, Darcy made his way to the library undetected. Pushing the door open, he stood there for a moment. The view from where he stood afforded a chance to behold Elizabeth standing before the window looking out. He cleared his throat, and when she turned to face him, he bowed slightly. "Miss Elizabeth." Her spirits slightly more animated than they were when they last saw each other, she smiled modestly. "You and I ought to know better than to continue meeting in such places as this, sir." He rightly surmised she was referring to their time alone in Netherfield's library. "I believe we can both agree that this particular library is much better stocked." "I understand both libraries are nothing in comparison to Pemberley's." She took a tentative step towards him. "I suppose I might soon form my own opinion in that regard." Darcy walked to her and took her hands in his. "Does this mean? Are you accepting my proposal?" "Yes, that is if you will still have me." "I do. That is to say, I will." He smiled. "Thank you for making me such a happy man." She slowly withdrew her hands. "Sir, you need not pretend that this is something you actually want. My father told me what led to your proposal." He swallowed. "I had hoped to protect you from learning about any of that. But I suppose in as small a society as this, such a thing would have been impossible." "Sir, you strike me as the sort of man who would do anything to avoid being trapped into marriage. You will indulge me, I pray, by explaining why you have so willingly chosen this course. You and I both know that nothing inappropriate took place when we were left alone for so long." "Scandal of any kind is my abhorrence. Although you and I know the truth, measures were taken to quiet the talk of our being alone, measures so desperate as to exaggerate the situation." "What sort of measures, may I ask?" "Miss Bingley, thinking she was protecting me, foolishly dismissed the servant who spoke about our being alone, which merely served to incite rather than squelch the speculation of scandal." Will the irony never cease? Elizabeth wondered. How she must hate herself now for being the means of your asking me to marry you, sir. How you must despise her as well. Darcy shook his head. "I am not pleased with her interference. However, I do not despise her. All things considered, I suppose I owe her, for I am happy to be your protector. I am looking forward to making you my wife, and spending the rest of my days with you." Stepping forward, Darcy lessened the distance between them. "Despite our situation, I am agreeable to a proper courtship period if that is your wish. My wish is that we shall be married sooner rather than later, for I fully intend to woo you, even as your husband." She raised her brow. "Do you mind if I ask, how does a man woo his own wife, sir?" Darcy seized her hands once again. "Tirelessly," he whispered. Moistening his lips and raising one of her hands to them,
He brushed a soft, lingering kiss across her knuckles. Yet unhurriedly. Smiling, Elizabeth reluctantly withdrew her hands. With such dizzying emotions as those evoked by his soft lips against her skin, she found herself wondering how a man she always believed to be cold and reserved could render her breathless and speechless. "When shall you like to inform your family of our news?" Realizing how her happy news affected Jane, Elizabeth said, "I should like very much to speak with my dearest sister Jane. My papa is already aware of what is unfolding between us. I am confident he will keep the news to himself. My mother will need to be told, but I pray you will allow me to do so after you have taken your leave. In fact, I ought to wait until the household is settled before I tell her. No doubt she will wish to shower you with approbation when next she sees you. Prepare yourself, sir. You have been warned." Elizabeth silently pondered that Mr. Collins would have to be told as well. She decided she would put it off until her mother had been told. Tomorrow morning will do quite nicely. Darcy would certainly not argue Elizabeth's point as regarded informing her mother. He knew enough about Mrs. Bennet to know that she would not take the news with composure. Although there was no changing the fact that Mrs. Bennet would soon be his mother-in-law, the prospect of spending the best part of the coming courtship period under her watchful eyes was not very pleasing. "I know things are progressing rather suddenly. You and I hardly know each other." "Granted," replied Elizabeth, "but I've heard it said that there is time enough for a man and his wife to get to know each other once they are married." In saying that, Elizabeth was referring to her intimate friend Charlotte Lucas's particular philosophy. Charlotte was a sensible woman. Moreover, she was practical, so practical that it would have come as no surprise to Elizabeth were her friend to accept a man the likes of her odious cousin. Nevertheless, being practical was precisely what Elizabeth's current situation called for. While she sometimes entertained fanciful notions of marrying only for the greatest love, the prospect of a scandal cast matters into an entirely different light. Besides, there was Jane's happiness to think of as well. Elizabeth's marriage to Mr. Darcy would be a means of saving Jane and herself from the odious Mr. Collins. Darcy said, "This is true. However, I want you to be happy." "I've also heard it said that happiness in marriage is purely a matter of chance." "That is a wise sentiment indeed. But there's no reason that we cannot get a healthy head start. I can think of any number of things we might do to speed us along the path to happily ever after. We need not wait until we are married and away from Hertfordshire." "What do you have in mind?" "Spend time alone with me. Tomorrow, for instance. Come riding with me." Elizabeth bit her lower lip. "What is the matter? Pray, I haven't offended you. We are to be married, but if the thought of being alone with me is discomforting, you are welcome to invite either of your sisters to join us." "It is not that," said Elizabeth after a moment's deliberation. "Then what is it?" "I am not a horsewoman, sir. My sister Jane is the only one of us who proudly boasts of such proficiency." "Pray, will you allow me to teach you?" "Is being a proper horsewoman a prerequisite for being the mistress of Pemberley, sir?" He shrugged. "There are no such preconditions, I assure you. However, I would consider it an honor if you allow me to teach you. Trust me, such a talent will prove invaluable when you come to your new home." Recalling her mission to embrace every prospect for happiness her future life afforded, Elizabeth half-smilingly said, "When shall we start?" "I recall your being an early riser during your sister's convalescence at Netherfield. Meet me soon after sunrise." Later that day, Elizabeth opened her heart to her eldest sister. "Dearest Jane," she said, "I have had the most eventful morning in my life. You will never guess what I have done." "Oh, Lizzie, we were all given to expect that you meant to take your time in considering Mr. Collins's proposal of marriage."
Jane, do you know nothing at all about me? Mr. Collins is the last man in the world I could ever be prevailed on to marry. I merely asked him to wait for my reply as a stalling tactic. I am rather certain I would never have said yes, and now I do not have to. As much as I understand that your character would have made it impossible for you to ever be truly happy with our cousin, why would you prolong his suspense in such a manner as you have suggested? I never thought you capable of deliberate cruelty to anyone. Oh, Jane, Mr. Collins made it impossible for me to do otherwise. He threatened to request your hand in marriage if I did not accept him. I could never allow such a thing to happen, never in 1,000 years. This leads me to my purpose in seeking you out. Mind you, I have not said a word to Mamma, as I wanted you to be the first to know, so you must promise to keep this between the two of us for now. Lizzie, I do not understand. You said Mr. Collins spoke of requesting my hand in marriage in one breath, and how you would never allow such a thing in another breath. Now you speak of having private affairs to discuss with me. Pray, what have you done? Here is a hint. Our mother will no doubt proclaim with a great flair that our family is saved when she learns of what has unfolded. No doubt she would be referring to the advantageous marriage of one of her daughters. Yet you have spoken of having rejected Mr. Collins. Oh, Jane, I cannot contain myself a moment longer. But first you must prepare yourself to be astounded. You see, my dearest sister, I am to be married to Mr. Darcy. Though suspicion was very far from Jane's general habits, she was absolutely incredulous. You are joking, Lizzie. This cannot be, engaged to Mr. Darcy. No, you shall not deceive me. I know it to be impossible. Oh, this is a wretched beginning indeed. My sole dependence was on you, for I am sure nobody else will believe me if you do not. Yet indeed I am in earnest. I speak nothing but the truth. Jane looked at her doubtingly. Oh, Lizzie, it cannot be. The two of you barely get along. Elizabeth again, and more seriously, assured her sister of its truth. But when? How? Dearest Jane, I am afraid the circumstances that led to Mr. Darcy's asking me to marry him are clouded by the threat of scandal having to do with our time at Netherfield. What happened at Netherfield that might be considered scandalous? Well, you recall my telling you that Mr. Darcy and I were left alone in the library by the others. Indeed. I recall thinking at the time that such a thing was not entirely appropriate, but knowing you and Mr. Darcy as well as I do, I was certain nothing untoward took place. Indeed, and the gentleman never said a word to me. However, there are those who would have others think differently. In his desire to protect me from such viciousness, Mr. Darcy asked me to be his wife, and I said yes. Lizzie, I did not know that you even liked him. How earnestly did Elizabeth then wish that her former opinions had been more reasonable, her expressions more moderate. It would have spared her from explanations and professions that were exceedingly awkward to give, albeit very necessary to reassure her sister. Jane, surely now that he and I are to be married, you will allow me to pretend that I never felt anything but admiration for him. Mr. Darcy is indeed an admirable man. I have always thought so. As he is to be my husband, I find myself being obliged to think the same way. She took her sister's hand in hers. Jane, you must absolutely promise me that should Mr. Collins seek to retaliate by extending his offer of marriage to you as he threatened, you will reject him, and in no uncertain terms. That ridiculous man does not take no for an answer without a great deal of debating, I'm afraid. Chapter 6. The Handsomest Woman. The next morning, Darcy arrived at the spot that he and Elizabeth had agreed upon. He was on horseback and holding the reins of a fine bay he had chosen for her riding lessons. Elizabeth's first lesson consisted mostly of her sitting astride the horse and Darcy walking alongside her,
holding the reins. His intention was to allow her to grow accustomed to the idea of being a horsewoman. The next day would be soon enough for her to ride unassisted. Darcy had another purpose for that morning as well, one that had nothing to do with riding. He meant to surprise Elizabeth with a light repast. He chose a lovely spot near the outskirts of Netherfield Park, ideally suited to his purposes. Wanting to assure their privacy, he had his man Waters oversee all the preparations and involve as few of the Netherfield servants as possible. Waters and the servants were gone by the time Darcy and Elizabeth arrived. It was solely the two of them. Elizabeth was not immune to the compliment her intended had paid her in arranging such an outing. "It's lovely, sir," said she, a little relieved that her feet were once again on the ground. She smiled up at Mr. Darcy. "Thank you for going to such lengths this morning on my behalf." "It is my pleasure." He extended his arm to her. "May I?" Elizabeth accepted his arm and commenced walking with him. Her stomach's rumbling told her that she was hungrier than she imagined she would be. There was little wonder. The day before had been marked by such turmoil that she had done little more than push her food around on her plate. The last time she had come close to nourishing herself properly had been interrupted by Mr. Collins' proposal. The thought of being married to such a ridiculous man as that was enough to turn her stomach. Hence she decided to put all thoughts of the silly man out of her mind. Now and again, she couldn't help wondering how he would bear the news that she was promised to Mr. Darcy. Having gained Jane's word that she would not entertain, even for a second, a retaliatory proposal of marriage from Mr. Collins, Elizabeth was quite content to remain where she was, in that idyllic spot by Mr. Darcy's side, for the better part of the day. If she were lucky, her cousin would be nowhere to be found by the time she returned to Longbourn. After partaking of the little feast spread out before them, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy began to talk of many of those things that two young people wanting to get to know each other better must surely discuss. "You have met most of my family, sir. However, I have yet to meet any of yours. Miss Bingley has sung your sister's praises so often I feel I know her already. However, I do look forward to making her acquaintance." "Miss Bingley would have you believe that a great deal of affection exists between my sister and herself. However, I assure you that nothing could be farther from the truth. That being said, Georgiana looks forward to meeting you as well." "She does? On what basis, if I may ask? Surely you have had no time to inform her of our engagement. Although I suppose you might have written a letter to her and had it delivered by express, I do not imagine there has been a sufficient passage of time to allow for a reply." He smiled sheepishly. "I wrote to my sister telling her about you weeks ago." "Oh? Allow me to guess what you said." Darcy said nothing, which encouraged Elizabeth to speak with impunity. Her spirits rising to playfulness, her voice heavy with a measure of prudishness, she said, "There is an impertinent country lass who has thrown herself into our party who simply will not go away." She looked at him pointedly. "What say you, sir? Have I managed to capture the essence of your missive to Miss Darcy?" Her teasing manner had a way of lowering his usual reserve. He really liked that about her. Her smile persuaded him that he was in no danger, and thus he responded to her in kind. "I would say you've managed very well." "Mr. Darcy!" Elizabeth cried, feigning outrage. He took her hand in his and raised it to his lips. "Surely you know I am speaking in jest. In truth, I only told my sister those things about you that would give a favourable impression of your character. Your kindness to your eldest sister, your fondness for walking, and your want to outwit Miss Bingley at every turn." "This is high praise indeed, and if I might say, entirely unexpected." "Unexpected?" "Indeed, sir. I always supposed you barely tolerated me." Here Darcy felt his colour rising,
and he began to wonder if Elizabeth had overheard his unflattering remark to his friend Bingley at the Meryton Assembly about her not being quite handsome enough to tempt him. What better time than that moment to amend any damage his carelessly spoken words may have inflicted? Miss Elizabeth, I would ask you to disregard anything you may have heard that would cause you to think that way, and consider these words instead. His voice tender, he said, "It was not long after we first met that I began to consider you the handsomest woman of my acquaintance." Wholly unprepared for the bewildering emotions his words invoked, Elizabeth sought to change the subject. "Pray tell me more about your family. My cousin, Mr. Collins, has taken a great deal of pleasure in regaling us with stories of your aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh's benevolence. Pray, how does her legend meet with actuality? Is she the most divine being ever to grace this earth, as my cousin espouses?" "I believe my aunt will testify that your cousin's assertions are exceedingly understated. She is very proud of herself, and she is not one to countenance dissenting opinions. She likes to have her own way in every aspect of life." "Oh dear. How do you suppose she will react once she learns that you are engaged to be married?" "I have reason to suspect that she will suffer the news poorly. However, let us not concern ourselves with my aunt at this time. I had much rather discuss those matters pertaining solely to the two of us." "I am afraid, sir, that I will not be so easily dissuaded as that. Surely, if your relations do not embrace our union, I ought to know."
"Miss Elizabeth, would knowing such a thing in any way affect your decision to marry me?"
"No."
"I knew you would not let the opinions of others influence you. You and I are so much alike in that respect. What do I care if her ladyship does not embrace our union? Her feelings are inconsequential. Should you be concerned that upon making her acquaintance she might say or do anything to injure you, do not be. Although I have no doubt of your ability to stand up for yourself against the likes of my aunt, you must always remember that I am your protector."
At first, Elizabeth thought she imagined the tiny moist prickles on her skin. "I do not think I have enjoyed such tranquillity in Mr. Darcy's company ever before. Pray our outing will last a good while longer." The tingling drops grew too impatient to be ignored, and before Elizabeth knew what she was about, Darcy seized her by the hand. The two of them raced over to a heavily wooded area in search of shelter from the pounding rain. They settled underneath a large tree. Her muslin gown and spencer now thoroughly soaked, she wrapped her arms around herself. She was shivering. Darcy quickly removed his greatcoat and walked behind her. Draping his coat over her shoulders, he said, "Pray this will help you keep warm until the rain ceases. Then I shall see you back to Longbourn." "Won't we be a sight when we return to Longbourn, both of us dripping wet?" Her voice now trembling from the damp clothing against her skin, she continued, "Pray this rain is not a precursor to a deluge similar to last week's, for then there would be no telling how long we will remain here."
"The Netherfield Manor House is just beyond these trees. Unless you are in a rush to return to Longbourn, you and I might return to Netherfield instead, where we may both change clothing."
"That is an excellent idea for you, but it hardly accommodates my needs, sir, unless you plan to lend me some of your attire."
"I shall change, and you shall have your privacy in another apartment while your things are drying by the fire, if that meets with your approval."
Elizabeth arched her brow. "I do not know that my reputation can afford such a prospect, sir," she teased.
"The worst that might happen is that your father will hear about it, and insist we marry sooner than planned. I am not entirely opposed to such a scheme."
Indeed, the sooner they married, the sooner he would spirit Elizabeth away to Derbyshire, the sooner he would make her his in every way. Chapter 7. Must now reconsider. Mr. Collins, having petitioned for and received a private audience with Mr. Bennet, took a seat in the chair on the opposite side of the large, rather cluttered desk that he would one day call his own. The thought that his future father-in-law might allow him to assume the role as head of Longbourn, even prior to the former's passing, did cross his mind once or twice in the hours since he asked for Elizabeth's hand. He did not wish to get too far ahead of himself. For the immediate future, he was more than happy to bring his bride to live with him in Hunsford. His position as Lady Catherine de Bourgh's vicar afforded him status and connections, the likes of which he was not eager to relinquish.
"I understand you wish to speak to me in privacy, sir," said the older man. "The floor is all yours."
"The floor, the ceiling, the walls, the windows, all of this will be mine soon enough,"
the younger man thought, but did not voice aloud. He had far more urgent matters to discuss. Clearing his throat, Mr. Collins said,
"Sir, I could not help noticing that your second eldest daughter was nowhere to be found this morning. I sorely missed her presence at breakfast. Pray, does she make a habit of going unaccounted for?"
Unwilling to answer the question directly, Mr. Bennet said,
"Is there a particular reason for your interest in my second eldest daughter's comings and goings?"
"Sir, you cannot possibly be a stranger to the fact that soon after my arrival I singled your second eldest daughter, cousin Elizabeth, out as the object of my most ardent fascination. Acting upon my profound admiration and esteem for your daughter, I offered her my hand in marriage, and in keeping with my character as a gentleman, I allowed her the additional time she requested before making me the happiest man in the world."
Mr. Bennet sat back in his winged armchair and steepled his hands before his face. He said not a word.
"Surely Mrs. Bennet will have spoken to you about my plans for Cousin Elizabeth. Under any other circumstances I would exercise more patience in awaiting my fair lady's reply, but it appears my time in Hertfordshire is drawing to a close. My noble patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, will want me to return to my duties as originally planned."
"Mr. Collins, I am afraid you will not be pleased with what I am about to tell you. It has to do with my daughter. It seems that there has been a new development since the two of you spoke."
The younger man's expression bore out his concern. He tugged at his collar.
"A new development?" he protested. "What manner of development?"
"Calm yourself, Mr. Collins. Is it not enough that you shall have all of this as soon as I am no longer of this earth? I have no say over any of that, nor do I have any say over whom my second eldest daughter chooses to marry. I will say, however, that had she chosen you, I would have been most seriously disappointed."
"It is my turn to express my disappointment, sir, for it pains me to hear you speak this way. In such cases as this, you will be wise to put your daughter's happiness above your own misguided interests."
"I have no reason to suspect that my daughter will not be exceedingly happy as the wife of Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy."
"Mr. Darcy!" Mr. Collins cried. "Surely you do not expect me to believe that the young gentleman, one who is looked up to as one of the most illustrious personages in this land, and is blessed in a peculiar way with everything the heart of mortal can most desire, splendid property, noble kindred, and extensive patronage, has made Cousin Elizabeth an offer of marriage."
"Believe what you will, sir. It in no way diminishes my joy for my daughter's future prospects. A man such as you just described will be the means of securing every wish a father might have for a most beloved child."
"For your sake as well as your daughter's, I can only pray this is an attempt on your part to make light of the honour I have bestowed on both you and your daughters. Let me assure you that the gentleman's aunt, my noble patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, would not look on this so-called match with a friendly eye.
her ladyship would be most seriously displeased." "That will be her misfortune indeed, but as the grand lady is so wholly unconnected to me and my family, I shall not give it a single care." By the look on Mr. Collins's face, he likened Mr. Bennet's words to blasphemy. "You ought to know, sir, I had planned to offer my hand in marriage to your eldest daughter, Miss Bennet, in the event Cousin Elizabeth's stubbornness exceeded her good judgment. However, I must now reconsider. A man in my position would have to be a fool to act so injudiciously in aligning himself with a family who had placed themselves on the wrong side of Lady Catherine de Bourgh's approbation. I suppose that is our misfortune, for no one who has suffered the pleasure of your company would accuse you of being a fool." Standing, Mr. Bennet continued, "I trust this conversation is over, sir, for I am much in need of the solace of my library." Mr. Collins, who thought of himself as one of the most decent and upstanding men he knew, had never been so offended in all his life. He had come all this way merely for the sake of extending an olive branch to the Bennets, and this was his payment, to be mocked and ridiculed, even worse, to be lied to. What else could it be but a scandalous falsehood? The nephew of his noble patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, would never offend his aristocratic family and the world in general by entering into such an unequal alliance as Mr. Thomas Bennet had suggested. Mr. Collins would not believe it. He could not believe it. He had seen no evidence that Mr. Darcy even knew his cousin Elizabeth, other than the fact that the two of them danced together at the Netherfield ball. Is that the basis for Mr. Bennet's fabrication? Collins's vexation was palpable. Elizabeth was as good as promised to him. He had spent the entire evening planning how his future life would be. She promised she would give him a favourable reply after a fair amount of consideration. Could that have been the reason for the clandestine looks between the father and the daughter at dinner last night? Did they mean to embarrass me before the eyes of the world with such subterfuge? His thoughts now tended to his situation in Kent. Her ladyship had told him to go forth and secure a wife, and he thought he had done it. Now what was he to do? His hands clutched behind his back, Collins paced the floor. I strongly suspect that my crafty cousin merely meant to deceive me. But what if, on the off chance, his assertion that his daughter is to be married to Mr. Darcy has some basis in truth? This is information that Lady Catherine ought to know. He walked straight over to the desk and retrieved his pen and paper. He read the beginnings of the letter to her ladyship, the one he had started just that morning, announcing his great expectation for future marital felicity. He balled up the unfinished letter and tossed it aside. What a waste of a fine piece of paper, he thought. A part of him refused to believe what his cousin had said. Mr. Darcy of Pemberley in Derbyshire was to be married to a young woman with no fortune, no connections, and nothing to recommend her save a pretty face. How preposterous! Even if Mr. Bennet was lying, toying with him as a means of prolonging his suspense, it was too late. He would not offer for his cousin, or any other Bennet daughter for that matter, even if they were the last single women in all of England. Some time later, Mr. Collins folded and sealed his letter. Writing it was such a balm to his badly bruised feelings. He found he could not wait to send the missive on its way. Not willing to chance that someone in the Longbourn household might intercept it, he set off to post the letter himself. He had not walked very far before he had the good fortune of meeting Miss Charlotte Lucas. The two of them had enjoyed such congenial intercourse at the Netherfield ball. He grinned. Now there is a sensible woman if ever I saw one. He arched his crooked brow. If I am not mistaken, she is Cousin Elizabeth's intimate friend. Mr. Collins knew in an instant how he needed to act. Chapter 8.
In suspense. Shortly afterward, Darcy and Elizabeth found themselves once again alone at Netherfield. Not wishing to alert any of the few household servants to Elizabeth's presence, Darcy had spirited her upstairs undetected. He led her to his apartment, only because he knew it was one of the few rooms that would have a proper fire, what with Bingley and all his relations being in town. Still wearing Mr. Darcy's greatcoat, Elizabeth stood at the fireplace warming her hands. As if mindful of propriety, Darcy remained standing by the half-opened door. "I trust this room meets with your approval." "It does. Unless I am mistaken, this is your apartment, sir." "Indeed?" "I hate to think I am inconveniencing you, sir." "No," said he, shaking his head. "On the contrary, for my man is preparing another room for me as we speak." The way he looked at her aroused a measure of nervous anticipation in Elizabeth. At length he said, "Should you need anything at all, I shall be in the apartment adjoining this one." Darcy paused a second and then turned to take his leave. "Mr. Darcy," said Elizabeth, halting him. He did an about-face. "Your coat," she said, clutching its broad velvety lapels. The masculine scent of it comforted her as much as the fire did. They met each other halfway. Elizabeth surrendered the garment. Folding it over his arm, Darcy prepared to quit the room. He made it as far as the door. She quickly removed her damp spencer. She shivered. Her voice trembling, she said, "Sir." "Miss Elizabeth," he said, turning to face her once more. "I'm afraid I require a bit of assistance. My dress, the laces." Darcy closed the door and tossed his coat on the bed. "Of course. Allow me to be of service." In an instant, he stood behind Elizabeth. She swept her damp hair to the side, and he commenced loosening the laces, slowly and deliberately. The irony of their situation was not lost on her. She dared not remark on it. A quiet chuckle escaped Elizabeth's mouth. "Pray, what are you thinking, Miss Elizabeth?" Now able to fend for herself, she turned to face him. "I dare not confess it, sir. Who is to say what you might then think of me?" "I am willing to chance it if you are. Pray, do not keep your husband-to-be in suspense." "Well, sir, there is much talk that we engaged in scandalous conduct that day in the library when you and I both know that nothing happened. What a shame it is to be accused of something one has no knowledge of." "What are you saying?" "Hushed whispers have the two of us committing the most egregious acts, when the truth is, I have never even been kissed." "I am not opposed to addressing your lack of, shall we say, experience. That is, supposing that you wish it." Teasing, she said, "You would really do such a thing? Commit such a selfless act on my behalf, sir? Is it not enough that I have sought your services as an abigail?" "I am not opposed to helping you along in any way I can. I would do anything for a worthy cause." By now, he stood directly in front of her, closer to her than he had ever been before. His eyes traced a path from her bewitching dark eyes to her tempting lips, her slender neckline, back to her lips, her eyes. Moistening his lips, he placed his hands about her neck and gently massaged her. He brushed his thumbs under her chin. Lifting her head, he leaned closer, closed his eyes, and kissed her. He gently coaxed her lips apart. Her lips taste utterly divine. Kissing her was everything he always dreamed it would be. Savouring the pleasure of their first kiss, Darcy allowed his mind to race ahead of him, thus giving way to thoughts of intimate caresses and more passionate kissing, followed by tender brushing of his fingers along her décolletage, her breasts, and the curve of her waist. He would ease her muslin gown from her shoulders, allowing it to fall to the floor. Then he would lift her in his arms and lower her to his bed. He'd lie next to her, and, still kissing her, begin raising her petticoat slowly, inch by inch, and commence trailing his fingers along her thighs, outside and within, until he reached the apex of her firm, slender legs. Should he find her moist, he would be satisfied that he had done his job. Should he not, he would return his fingers to her neckline and slowly trail them once again to her breasts. Then he would allow his lips to trace the same sensuous path as his fingers, taking care not to leave evidence of his ardent ministrations on her creamy skin. More urgency would ensue once his mouth pressed ardently against her bosom. When next his fingers found themselves where they had been earlier, she was sure to be wet, and, with only the slightest encouragement, his lips would then replace his fingers once again. The longer his lips lingered tenderly on hers, the more burning became his desire. His impassioned mind refused to surrender his intoxicating imaginings. Were they any place other than his bedroom, he was certain he would not be entertaining such fantasies. Darcy broke off the kiss. He rested his forehead against hers, and they remained in that attitude a few moments longer. "I shall wait for you in the parlour." With those words, he hastily quit the room. Later, Darcy and Elizabeth slowly made their way to Longbourn, both on horseback, with him holding the reins for her. The steady clopping of hooves was the only sound to be heard. In vain, Darcy struggled to think of anything other than what had unfolded between the two of them in his apartment. How wonderful it felt finally to kiss Elizabeth. Thoughts of making love to her had been creeping into his dreams since he first met her. He never imagined he would actually find himself in such a position owing to the difference in their circumstances. Her low connections and lack of fortune meant nothing to him now. They were bound to each other. For the rest of his life, no one would ever mean more to him than Elizabeth would. As much as he longed to be soon kissing her again, a part of him knew that such a thing would never do. The last thing he wanted was to frighten her with his aching longings. With every fibre of his being, he yearned for her. However, he had no wish to seduce her before they exchanged vows. He wanted her the right way, as his wife. He wanted their first time together to be in the comfort of his own home, her new home. I must regulate my ardent desires for her until we are man and wife. When she wasn't looking, Darcy studied Elizabeth's lovely face. He would not cease berating himself for allowing his passions to get ahead of him. He wanted Elizabeth to be comfortable in his presence, but he did not mean to take advantage of her lack of experience as a means of satisfying his own baser needs. I shall not allow my desires to get in the way of tomorrow's lesson, assuming she will even consent to meet me after my conduct this morning. For Elizabeth's part, her feelings bore an odd measure of guilt laced with curiosity. The abrupt cessation of their kiss, followed by his swift departure from the room, had spoken volumes. Surely he will think my behaviour unbecoming for having allowed him such a liberty. However, he and I are to be married. If I know anything about him, it is that he is a passionate man. Our kiss was surely a confirmation of that. The silence between them was intolerable, and Elizabeth sought to put an end to it. "You have been rather quiet, Mr. Darcy." "Tell me what you wish for me to say, and it will be said." Elizabeth looked into his eyes. "Sir, I insist that you rid yourself of your tendency to put up such walls between us. I tolerated such tactics when we first met, but I do not know that I can countenance doing so now. Not after this morning." I have been silently admonishing myself for allowing matters to unfold as they did."
"Are you saying that you are sorry you kissed me, sir?"
"No. I am sorry for the thoughts that accompanied our first kiss."
"If I may ask, what thoughts were those?"
"Are you laughing at me, Elizabeth? Pardon, Miss Elizabeth?"
"I would not dare. I know all too well that you are not to be laughed at, sir. However, I would ask that you cease scolding yourself over that which you cannot possibly control. What is the point in that?"
"I do not know that you would be nearly so generous if you knew where my private thoughts took me." Darcy swallowed. "Took us."
"Sir, it is true that I have little experience with regard to what happens when a man and a woman commit themselves to each other. However, I am not entirely ignorant on the matter. You've seen my father's library. You ought to know I have made good use of my time perusing those books he believes are tucked safely away in the farthest recesses of the stacks. Now, despise me if you dare."
"Miss Elizabeth!"
"Pray you will pardon me, sir, if I have offended your sensibilities. I only meant to relieve you of the burden you are suffering, that you may have bruised mine."
Darcy was no stranger to the fact that Elizabeth enjoyed professing opinions that were not always her own, merely for sport. This he counted as one of the many things he admired about her. His spirits lightened, he was more than happy to oblige her in her teasing game. He slid down from his tall stallion and strode to Elizabeth's mount. Placing his hands around her tiny waist, he lowered her to the ground. Allowing scant space between them, he removed one hand from her waist and lifted her chin with his finger. His eyes daring, he peered into hers. "Shall I take it that your reading experiences have prepared you for all you need to know about what happens between a man and a woman?"
Elizabeth gulped. Her heart slammed against her chest. Biting her lower lip, she said, "No." Leaning closer, he whispered in her ear, "Good, for that will be my job." His warm breath against her skin stirred her entire being. His eyes feasting on her face, he moistened his lips. "Come," he said tenderly, taking her hand in his. "Let us walk the remainder of the way." Strolling along, Elizabeth could scarcely calm her racing heartbeat. What in the world was I thinking to be teasing him? I ought to know by now that such a man is not to be toyed with. The way he stared at her sent piercing sensations coursing through her body that lingered still. Even the touch of his hand caused her stomach to flutter. Elizabeth did not know whether to be pleased with herself, knowing just how much Mr. Darcy was in her power, or deeply concerned with the knowledge of just how much she was surrendering herself to his. Chapter 9. "'Tis as good as the Lord." Soon after, Elizabeth entered the house and handed the awaiting servant her bonnet. Her mamma approached her directly.
"Lizzie, my wonderful child, pray where on earth have you been all this time? I had expected you to return from your morning ramble hours ago."
The sight of her mother recalled Elizabeth to the evening before. When her mother went up to her dressing room, Elizabeth followed her and made the important communication. Its effect was most extraordinary, for on first hearing it, Mrs. Bennet sat quite still, unable to utter a syllable. At length she began to recover. She fidgeted about in her chair, got up, sat down, wondered, and blessed herself.
"Goodness gracious! Lord bless me! Oh, only think! Oh, dear me, Mr. Darcy! Who would have thought it? And is it really true? Oh, my sweetest Lizzie, how rich and how great you will be! What pin money, what jewels, what carriages you will have! Oh, I am so pleased, so happy! Oh, such a charming man, so handsome, so tall. Oh, my dear Lizzie, pray apologise for my having disliked him so much before. Oh, I hope he will overlook it. Dear, dear Lizzie, a house in town, everything that is charming, 10,000 a year. Oh, Lord, what will become of me? I shall go distracted.
This was enough to prove that her approbation need not be doubted, and all her hopes of an alliance with Longbourn's heir forgotten. Elizabeth, rejoicing that such an effusion was heard only by herself, soon went away. But before she had been 3 minutes in her own room, her mother followed her.
My dearest child, she cried, I can think of nothing else. 10,000 a year, and very likely more. 'Tis as good as a lord, and a special licence. You must and shall be married by a special licence. Oh, I do not know how I shall ever sleep tonight. There is so much to entertain.
Elizabeth hoped that by now her mamma had accustomed herself to the news, thus sparing Mr. Darcy the prospect of an unseemly spectacle. I was caught in the rain and sought shelter at—
You certainly do not look like someone who was caught in the rain. Your clothes are as dry as can be. Oh, never mind all that. Run upstairs and change into something more fitting for your future husband. He has £10,000, you know, and I shall expect him to call on Longbourn at any moment. Put on the lovely dress that I had Sarah place on your bed. You must look your best for Mr. Darcy, else he might change his mind.
Mrs. Bennet continued,
Oh, I am most eager to share our family's happy news with all my neighbours. However, I do not dare until I have undeniable proof that Mr. Darcy did not awaken this morning to realise that he had made a mistake and change his mind.
Elizabeth could hardly blame her mother for her scepticism. There was a moment in the middle of the night before where she did not believe that Mr. Darcy had proposed to her either. Everyone expected that Jane would be the one to marry one of the handsome, wealthy gentlemen from town. No one expected it to be Elizabeth, not even Elizabeth herself. She owed it all to an innocent half-hour or so in Netherfield's library. A pang of guilt overspread her being. What happened this morning at Netherfield was anything but innocent, even if they were engaged to be married. The tender brush of his fingers along her back as he loosened her laces, the subtle whiff of spice and sandalwood when he stood so close to her, and the sweet taste of his lips when they kissed flooded her mind. Mr. Darcy had awakened desires in her that she had only read about. Pray he does not regard my conduct as wanton when I merely meant to challenge him. I would not like to think I need to change my high-spiritedness in order to maintain his good opinion, but I suppose a little temperance will not hurt. Elizabeth resolved that a bit more guardedness on her part was exactly what was in order. The sound of a gentleman clearing his throat prompted her mother to spin around on her heels.
Mr. Darcy!
She hurried to him, took him by the hand, and clutched it firmly in hers.
Oh, this is a happy day indeed. Come, sir, make yourself comfortable. Pray you will join us for dinner this evening. I shall invite all the best families, and I shall order cook to prepare all your favourites.
Releasing his hand, Mrs. Bennet took hold of one of his arms, and commenced leading him to the parlour.
That is to say, once you have advised me of your favourites, sir. I assure you that cook will do a splendid job, although I suppose you have 2 or 3 French cooks at least. However, you will not be disappointed.
Mrs. Bennet glanced over her shoulder and saw Elizabeth was still standing in the exact spot as when her betrothed arrived, her mouth agape. Mrs. Bennet's eyes then flew in the direction of the stairs in a not-so-subtle hint to her daughter to run along and change into the lovely gown in her room. After dinner that evening, Mrs. Bennet was in very great spirits. She made it her business to accept the glad wishes of all those invited to celebrate her good fortune in the spirit of a proud mamma who had done her duty in seeing her daughter make such an excellent match. Her sister's commendations were somewhat less flattering than Mrs. Bennet might have hoped, although she could not say she was surprised. She always suspected her dear sister, Mrs. Agatha Phillips, who had married a Meryton attorney as opposed to a gentleman of leisure, and whose youthful beauty was not to be compared to her own handsome looks, was rather jealous. Mrs. Phillips said,
It is my understanding that Mr. Darcy had no choice but to marry our Lizzie, if he wished to retain the right to call himself a true gentleman. The other woman arched her brow. What are you saying, sister? Surely you are privy to the fact that Lizzie and Mr. Darcy spent a prodigious amount of time alone in the library at Netherfield, just the two of them, when she and Jane were guests. Rumour also has it that they were known to take long walks to the exclusion of the rest of the Bingley party. Need I remind you that Lizzie was the only young woman he danced with at the ball, save his friends from town? But wait, for I've been remiss in not telling you the wickedest part of it all. She lowered her voice and leaned in. A servant who could be overheard remarking upon the affair was dismissed shortly thereafter. Resuming her former attitude, she said, "Now that you have heard it all, what say you about that?" It would take more than such a piddling account of how her good fortune came to be than this to rob Mrs. Bennet of her joy. Oh, my Lizzie is a cunning girl indeed to have found herself in such a position. She smiled knowingly. I always supposed my second eldest daughter could not be so clever for nothing. Having been described as an elegant woman by Longbourn's heir on first making her acquaintance, Mrs. Phillips's real opinion of him would not be repressed. Certainly too clever to settle for the likes of Mr. William Collins, I'd say. Mrs. Phillips was anything but elegant. A favourite of her younger nieces, who was always the best source of the latest gossip in town, the lady was often described as rather vulgar. Mrs. Bennet waved her handkerchief in the air dismissively. "Oh, forget about Mr. Collins!" Mrs. Phillips peered over the rim of her spectacles. "Then you are not at all concerned that he spent the greater part of the day at Lucas Lodge, paying court to Sir William's eldest daughter?" Mrs. Bennet huffed. "Oh, I could not care one jot where he goes or with whom he spends his time. Our Mr. Darcy is 100 times that gentleman's consequence, I am sure." Elizabeth received an abundance of felicitations that evening. She could honestly say her intended suffered her friends' and neighbours' good wishes with ample civility, so as to give no one any cause to complain. She also had opportunities to be snubbed a time or two. Her aggrieved cousin went out of his way to avoid her as best he could. She wondered at his being there. True, he was still a guest at Longbourn, but surely he took no pleasure in it. She came to suspect his purposes, plain and simple, were to vex her. He spent a great deal of time wooing her friend Charlotte. Elizabeth could not be too disheartened by the swift transference of his affection, despite what it portended for her friend. At least he wasn't wooing Jane. My sister is safe. Before the evening drew to a close, Darcy and Elizabeth found a quiet moment alone. She said, "I imagine you will want to return to Derbyshire before Christmas, Mr. Darcy. You must miss your home." To be honest, Miss Elizabeth, I had looked forward to returning to Derbyshire for December. My sister and I spent Christmas in Matlock with my late mother's family, he replied, his hands clutched behind his back. "You have my condolences on the loss of your parents, sir," she said, her voice solemn. "I appreciate your saying that." "You said you had looked forward to returning to Derbyshire. Is that to say your feelings have changed?" "Must you even ask?" He took her by the hand. "I have no intention of spending an entire month apart from you. As much as I love my family, and no doubt I will miss them dearly, my time is better spent here with you. How I wish we might be married soon, so you might come to Derbyshire with me." He kissed her hand. "However, such a scheme would require that you spend the season away from your family, and I do not expect you to make such a sacrifice. Next year, we shall invite all our relatives to celebrate Christmas with us at Pemberley. That is, of course, assuming such a prospect would bring you pleasure." "I do believe I should like that very much, sir. However, I should also like you to consider that I am very aware that, as much as I love my family, our lives are irrevocably intertwined. I would not consider it a sacrifice were I to spend this Christmas in Derbyshire." "Miss Elizabeth, I was under the impression that you wanted a long engagement."
Remembering the exquisite sensations of his kisses alone gave Elizabeth to consider that, if such pleasurable delights were a semblance of what she might expect as his wife, she had no wish to wait too long. Darcy and Elizabeth parted company with an agreement that she would invite Jane to accompany them to Derbyshire after the wedding, along with Georgiana. That way, Elizabeth would have at least one member of her Bennet family with her at Christmas time. All that was needed now was to convince Jane to go along with the scheme. Jane would do anything for her sister, including removing herself from Longbourn to reside at Pemberley. That did not mean she suffered no reservations.
Dearest Lizzie, you must know that I would love to go along with you to Pemberley. The prospect of the season in town is delightful as well. But pray, Lizzie, tell me anything except you are making this offer because you hope to throw me in Mr. Bingley's path.
Jane, have you no wish to see Mr. Bingley? I know how much you like him, and I know he is equally smitten with you.
Yes, I would wish very much to see Mr. Bingley. However, I am ever mindful of not wanting to hinder your getting to know Mr. Darcy. You shall be newlyweds.
Jane, I assure you that you need not worry in that regard. I want you to be with me, and what's more, Mr. Darcy wants it too. He knows how much I depend on you. His sister, Miss Darcy, will also be living with us at Pemberley. Lying in bed that night, Elizabeth reflected on her talk with her eldest sister. She congratulated herself on having avoided confiding her true intention of throwing Jane in Mr. Bingley's path. She did not want to lie, and she would have had she denied that it was her greatest hope that Jane and Bingley would enjoy much time in each other's company. With any luck, Longbourn would soon be celebrating 2 weddings. Chapter 10. Arts and Allurements. London, Darcy House. For the most part, the day was off to a very good start. The manner in which Elizabeth and Miss Georgiana Darcy were getting along was a further testimony to Darcy that Elizabeth would be an excellent mistress of his homes. He suspected that Elizabeth had been misled by Miss Bingley's fervent commendations, and had been taught to expect his sister to be proud, one who thought meanly of others in comparison to herself. Nothing could be further from the truth. Like Elizabeth, Georgiana was kind and considerate of others. If he had but one complaint about his sister, 12 years his junior, it was that she was shy. Darcy was certain all that would change with Elizabeth's help. Darcy glanced at the mantel clock. He had been sitting with the ladies for some time, doing his best to ignore his future mother-in-law's excessive praises about her second eldest daughter's good fortune. He started to entertain the idea that his time, as well as his composure, would be better served away from Mrs. Bennet, if only for an hour or so, while Georgiana and Elizabeth got to know each other better. Such behaviour as he observed in Mrs. Bennet caused a stirring of sympathy for the man who would soon be his father-in-law. Having spent so much time at Longbourn of late, yet very little of it in Mr. Bennet's company because the latter was always disappearing into his library for hours, Darcy swore he would not employ such stratagems in order to escape his family. His first afternoon in his own home in a similar circumstance as one Mr. Bennet likely enjoyed on a daily basis gave him to know that it simply must be done. Georgiana's soft voice interrupted his musings.
Brother, I should like very much to give Miss Elizabeth a tour of the house. We would be very honoured were you to join us.
A tour sounds like an excellent idea. However, here he looked at his future wife, his expression begging for understanding. I have matters that have gone unattended for far too long that I must address before returning to Hertfordshire. Elizabeth's smile confirmed she was not wounded by what might very well amount to abandonment on his part. Her teasing further confirmed it. No doubt your brother is eager to seek solace after spending the better part of the past hour entertaining discussions of laces and finery. Mrs. Bennet said, "Oh, I shall be delighted to see the house as well." She turned to Mrs. Annesley, Georgiana's companion. "Pray will you accompany us? For I shall have several recommendations for improvements to the rooms, I am sure. I do wish to keep track of them. Surely you will do the job nicely." Elizabeth was appalled. She knew her mother could be vulgar, but she had hoped that being in Mr. Darcy's home might give her cause for more reverence. "Mamma!" she cried, wondering what her future sister-in-law must think, and hoping and praying that Mrs. Annesley had not taken offence. Mrs. Annesley replied, "Indeed, I shall be happy to accompany you all. I never tire of seeing the many splendours of Mr. Darcy's home." With that, Darcy watched as the ladies all stood and quit the room. Then he did likewise. He had not made it very far down the long hallway when he heard his butler speaking with someone at the door. Moments later, he heard the piercing voice of one of the most irritating people of his acquaintance, Miss Caroline Bingley. What on earth is she doing here? He raked his fingers through his hair. The last thing he wanted was to have Elizabeth's first visit to his home marred by Miss Bingley's presence. He quickly made his way to the door, but he was too late. The young lady and her sister, Mrs. Hurst, were being shown into the room he had recently vacated. He passed by his butler, who threw him an apologetic look. Darcy held up his hand. "I shall handle matters." He marched into the room. Bowing, he said, "Mrs. Hurst, Miss Bingley, to what do I owe the pleasure of this visit?" The younger woman said, "Surely you do not expect us to stay away, knowing that you had returned to town. Pray you have come to your senses and freed yourself from the notion that marrying that Eliza Bennet to save her from a scandal of her own making is the best way to handle matters." "Pray, how did you come to be aware of my being in town, Miss Bingley?" Unabashed flirtation flitted across her face. She batted her eyelashes coquettishly. "I have my way of knowing such things, sir." "Then you ought to know that when I returned to London I was not unaccompanied." The colour drained from Miss Bingley's face. "Surely you did not venture to town with any of those savages? What are you thinking, sir, to be exposing anyone from Hertfordshire to our society?" "Miss Bingley, if we are to continue our acquaintance, then you had better learn to speak about my future wife and all her family with proper deference." "Surely you do not mean to say that you would turn your back on one of your closest friends merely for the sake of people of no consequence to the world?" "It is true that your brother and I are the closest of friends. You and I can boast of no such attachment. As he has always regarded the Bennets highly, I can honestly say there is no danger of the two of us going our separate ways because of my decision to marry Miss Elizabeth. In fact, were your brother in town, I am sure he would be most eager to renew his acquaintance with Miss Jane Bennet, whom I also accompanied to London." "Then it is a good thing he is not in town. To the extent it is in my power, I shall do everything to assure that he stays away for so long as it takes to keep him out of danger." "If you consider my future wife and her sister to pose a threat, then you ought not to be here. In fact, I invite you to leave before the ladies complete their tour of the house." "Do you mean to say they are here, at Darcy House, the two of them, Miss Eliza and Miss Bennet?" "Indeed, both ladies are here, as well as my future mother-in-law. Oh, and let me not forget to mention that Mrs. Gardiner, Miss Elizabeth's aunt, also is here. Heaven forbid that it should be made known that you have been spending time in the company of such people." Darcy strolled over to the door. Pulling it open, he saw his butler standing there. "Please see these ladies out of my home." "As you wish, Mr. Darcy." "Furthermore, I am not to be disturbed by uninvited guests for the remainder of my stay in town," he said, in a lower voice. "Yes, sir." Darcy returned his attention to the Bingley sisters. He bowed. "Good afternoon, ladies." Without brooking his uninvited and equally unwelcomed caller's protest, he quit the room. The most promising thought lingered in Elizabeth's mind throughout the tour of Mr. Darcy's home. To be mistress of such a place will truly be something. What a saint Mrs. Annesley had been, suffering Mrs. Bennet's effusions with such patience and grace. There was little wonder that Mr. Darcy trusted her with his sister's care. Elizabeth's aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, an elegant, intelligent woman, more than once took Elizabeth aside and remarked on what a beautiful home it was. Elizabeth could not help but agree. She was impressed by everything she saw, and she could well imagine living in such a place for years without changing a single thing. The expression on Miss Darcy's face and the joy in her voice spoke of her pleasure in having passed so many of her days of youth roaming those very halls. Talk of both her late parents was necessary every now and again, allowing Elizabeth a telling glimpse into Miss Darcy's character as well as her brother's. Elizabeth had always taken it for granted that a family was comprised of two parents, a father and a mother. She began to consider that having lost both parents at such a tender age must certainly have defined the siblings. She knew and understood how the difference in their ages must have fashioned Mr. Darcy's decision to provide Miss Darcy with her own establishment. No doubt he felt she needed greater stability than a life with a single gentleman, whose prospects are always increasing, affords. Still, she could not help considering how much joy it would indeed bring the Darcys once they were all living together at Pemberley. Standing apart from the others, Elizabeth watched and admired her own sister Jane and Miss Darcy. The two of them had so much in common: gentle natures, angelic countenances, and soft manners. No doubt Miss Darcy will grow to rely on Jane as much as I do. The anxieties that accompanied Elizabeth from Cheapside to Grosvenor Square earlier were fading with each passing moment. The day had turned out perfect in every way. Nothing could pierce Elizabeth's joy, and a part of her soon began to miss the one person who had made it all possible, Mr. Darcy. Desiring some time alone with him before her party returned to Cheapside, Elizabeth made some excuse of wanting to refresh herself, and then quit the party. Descending the winding stairs, she heard raised voices. A proud woman, whose countenance bore a slight resemblance to a picture of the late Lady Anne Darcy that Elizabeth had admired not 15 minutes earlier, was standing there badgering the butler. The tall, large woman with strongly marked features which might once have been handsome cast her eagle eyes upon Elizabeth.
"You there, servant girl! I demand to see my nephew at once."
Her nephew? Elizabeth recalled Mr. Darcy telling her that he had two aunts, Lady Ellen Fitzwilliam and Lady Catherine de Bourgh. The former an elegant, amiable woman, and the latter likewise elegant, but not very agreeable. This one must surely be the disagreeable aunt. "I beg your pardon, your ladyship," said Elizabeth.
"You heard me. Locate your master at once. Tell him that his insolent butler refuses to grant me an audience with him."
The austere man said, "I am afraid you have made a grave mistake, my lady. The young lady is no servant." By now, Elizabeth was standing directly in front of the unpleasant aristocrat. "Sir, if you will allow, I shall handle this matter." With that, the butler bowed and went on his way, thus leaving the two ladies to their own volition.
"Who are you to be speaking to that gentleman in such a way? Surely my nephew has not employed someone as young as you to oversee his London home."
"I am Miss Elizabeth Bennet, and I can only surmise that you are Lady Catherine de Bourgh. I would like to say it is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, but I would not wish to have the start of our relationship marked by a lie."
"So you are the impertinent little upstart who has used your arts and allurements to entice my nephew into forgetting what he is about. How dare you speak to me this way?"
Elizabeth conjured a serene attitude. "Your ladyship, if you will join me in the drawing-room," she said, already heading that way. As the household's future mistress, she did not intend to be a party to a spectacle with one of Mr. Darcy's relatives that might very well be spoken of for years to come. When the women were inside the room, Elizabeth closed the door. Pray have a seat." She did not expect their conversation to be pleasant, but she did not mean to be intimidated. "May I call for refreshments, your ladyship? Will you take tea?" The older woman reared her head in stunned indignation. "How dare you comport yourself as though you had the right to preside over my late sister's home?" Refusing to return the slightest bit of civility, her ladyship narrowed her eyes. "Do not think I am a stranger to you or your situation, young lady. I know it all. You are the second eldest daughter of a supposed gentleman whose Hertfordshire estate, such that it is, barely sustains his family." She shook her head in disdain. "5 daughters all out, and the eldest is not married, and none of you have had the benefit of a governess or the masters. What's more, your home is entailed to none other than my vicar, Mr. Collins, who may very well turn your mother and all your sisters out as soon as your father passes. You have no fortune and no connections, and you dare to stand before me and make a mockery of my own noble family by presuming to stand in my late sister's shoes. Have you no shame, no dignity, no sense of right and wrong?" "These are heavy complaints against me and my family. But if Mr. Darcy has no objections, then why should you?" "My nephew is an honourable, decent man who has fallen victim to the sins of lust and deprivation, dare I suspect copulation, given the likes of you." Elizabeth did not intend to allow such a salacious slur to go unchallenged. She looked at the older woman sharply. "How dare you speak to me this way? Do you deny you have used your feminine wiles to their greatest advantage and caused my nephew to forget his duty to his family? That is precisely my purpose in coming all this way to see him. I did not expect to find you here. I rather hoped he had put some distance between the two of you since he hastily proposed marriage to you, so he might gain proper perspective. However, you are here, and it is just as well. You strike me as a reasonable young woman. Surely you can see the folly in such an unequal alliance. Your situation is so far beneath my nephew's as to be considered laughable. What's more, you know nothing at all about him, else you would not be standing here." "What is there to know, other than he cares for me, that he is an honourable, respectable man, and that he and I are to be married?" "Did you know he was already engaged to be married to another long before he met you?" Elizabeth was unable to hide her surprise at hearing this. No doubt Lady Catherine read Elizabeth's unsettled expression. Her ladyship drew closer. "Indeed, his engagement is of a peculiar nature, to my daughter Anne. From their cradles they were designed for each other. I will not have the favourite wish of a most beloved sister as well as myself thwarted by someone who can mean nothing to anyone of consequence." "Pardon me, your ladyship," said Elizabeth, finding her voice in the wake of such a jarring revelation. "You and your sister did your part in planning such a union. Its execution is entirely up to others." "That is where you are mistaken. I know in my heart that my nephew intended to go through with the marriage. He merely required time to relinquish his life as a bachelor, to sow his wild oats, as it were. Surely he meant to ask for my daughter's hand in the next year or 2. At that moment, Darcy stormed into the room. "Enough, Lady Catherine! How dare you enter my home and speak to my intended in such an offensive manner?" Her ladyship's countenance soured. "Your intended? Your family has always regarded my Anne as your intended, have we not? Deny it if you will." Darcy took Elizabeth's hand. "I would ask for time alone with my aunt. Pray you will understand." "On the contrary, sir, I insist upon remaining and defending myself." Placing his hand along the small of her back, subtly coaxing her towards the door, he spoke for Elizabeth's ears only. "I have confidence that you would do the job admirably. However, I do not wish for my sister to be a witness to any of this. It would mean a great deal to me if you would return to her side and keep her occupied until my aunt has gone away." Agreeing to Mr. Darcy's request, and taking no leave of Lady Catherine, who surely deserved no such consideration, Elizabeth quit the room. As soon as the door was closed behind her, she heard loud voices, and she began to consider that Mr. Darcy was right. His young sister should never be exposed to such a spectacle. Later, when Lady Catherine was gone and the house had returned to normal, Darcy and Elizabeth found a moment alone. "I am sorry for my aunt's conduct. I assure you that you will find my aunt, Lady Ellen, to be quite the opposite when we spend Christmas in Matlock." Elizabeth asked about the Earl of Matlock, Lady Catherine's brother. "Will you promise that he is nothing like Lady Catherine as well?" She folded her arms in front of her. "If he harbours the same sentiments as his sister, I assure you I have no wish to spend Christmas in his home." "What did my aunt say that has given rise to such an expectation?" Elizabeth continued. "She mentioned that her daughter and you were destined for each other at birth." She placed her hands on her waist. "You might have told me this, sir. Then I might have been prepared for your aunt's vitriol." Darcy said, "There is a reason I omitted telling you such nonsense. It is because I have never entertained the idea of such an alliance." "Why ever not?" "My cousin is of rather a sickly constitution for one, but that is not the entire reason. I have always desired wit, charm, vitality, and passion in the woman who would be my wife. I believe I have found all that and more in you." Darcy seized Elizabeth's hand and raised it to his lips. "Shall we move ahead with our plans to marry when we return to Hertfordshire, or shall we allow Lady Catherine to prevail, Elizabeth, my love?" "My love, Mr. Darcy? Shall I consider such tender words as evidence of your increasing regard, or shall I consider them rather a fond endearment?" "Both, actually. For one, I can think of no better way to address you. Most importantly, I am falling in love with you." He brushed a kiss across her knuckles. "More and more each day." Elizabeth's warm smile encouraged him to continue. "The truth is, I have secretly entertained the idea of us being married longer than you know. From the moment you accepted my proposal, I have grown accustomed to thinking of our lives together as one. That is not to say there will be no more trials similar to the one with my aunt, but we will face them together. I never wish to be parted from you." Darcy clasped her hand in his. "Pray you share a modicum of my sentiments." "I must confess that the thought of being your wife is one I joyfully entertain during my every waking hour. I wish for nothing that might deter us from the course we've set." "Dare I suppose that is your way of saying you like me?" "I do indeed, sir. I like you very much. You might venture to say I am falling in love with you." Elizabeth raised his hand to her lips and brushed a kiss across his knuckles. "More and more each day." Darcy's heart leapt with joy at the idea of what Elizabeth's words foretold of their future marital felicity. The idea of theirs being a love match rather than a forced alliance warmed his heart. Thus inspired, he said, "May I ask when you first realized your feelings had begun to undergo such a promising change?" Her spirits rising to playfulness, she replied, "If I am forced to name the time and the place, I would have to trace it to the moment I entered your magnificent home." Darcy laughed wholeheartedly at this accounting. Only Elizabeth could say such a thing without giving offence. Squeezing her hand, he said, "Our magnificent home." Chapter 11. The means of uniting them. Having procured a special license while in town, Darcy and Elizabeth began their lives as one within days of returning to Hertfordshire. What a happy day it was for Mrs. Bennet. In addition to getting rid of her second eldest daughter, she also had the good fortune of knowing that her Jane was soon to be married as well, to Mr. Charles Bingley. Indeed, having returned to Hertfordshire in time to stand up for his closest friend, the young man answered his own heart's calling too.
He and Jane were to be married in 2 months. Miss Charlotte Lucas's pending marriage to the heir of Longbourn was nothing in comparison to such happy news as this. The only thing left for Mrs. Bennet to complain about was that Jane would soon be away in Derbyshire with Mr. and Mrs. Darcy at Christmas time. Why shouldn't all her girls have a chance to enjoy the gaieties of that season in such splendour? Her recent stay in town had afforded her the opportunity to meet 2 of Mr. Darcy's cousins, one of them a viscount, the other an officer, and both of them single. What a good thing for her girls! Her comfort was in knowing that the Darcys would be in town for the London season. So would Mary, Kitty and Lydia if Mrs. Bennet had a say in the matter. The militia being in town did not alter Mrs. Bennet's stance, for it had led to no marital prospects at all for her girls. If only her Kitty or her Lydia had been as fortunate as Miss Mary King from a neighbouring estate. That young woman had inherited a fortune of £10,000, and in so doing had attracted the ardent admiration of her youngest daughter's favourite beau, Lieutenant George Wickham. This, too, was just as well. Anyone who knew anything at all about the goings-on in Meryton knew that Mr. Darcy and Wickham did not like each other. Rumours abounded that Darcy had used Wickham very badly. As a result, the latter did not call at Longbourn whenever the former was there, which turned out to be more often than not. By virtue of Darcy and Elizabeth always being in each other's company since the day after the Netherfield ball when their engagement period began, Elizabeth never did get the chance to learn what her youngest sister's enthusiasm for the lieutenant was all about. Again, it was just as well. Mr. Bennet had no wish to pierce his wife's bliss over what it must mean to have secured such advantageous matches for 2 of her daughters. He neither said nor did anything to give her cause to believe that her wishes for the other girls would not unfold as she planned. Why risk introducing disharmony during such a cheerful time? His joy that his favourite daughter did not seem the least bit unhappy about the prospect of leaving his home with a man whose acquaintance she had made only 3 short months ago was just as he wished it would be. Between his daughter and Mr. Darcy there was mutual respect as well as affection, and, if pressed, Mr. Bennet would confess he detected in the young couple the makings of a deep and abiding love. He told his daughter as much. "Mr. Darcy deserves you. I could not have parted with you, my Lizzie, to anyone less worthy." Miss Caroline Bingley also returned to Hertfordshire to witness Mr. Darcy's nuptials. Her motive had been simple. She did not wish to lose her right to visit Pemberley. If the young woman was the least bit aggrieved that those Bennets would soon boast of a connection to her own family, she did nothing to evidence her displeasure. Still, she could not help reprimanding herself for her part in Mr. Darcy's decision to sacrifice himself on the altar of Eliza Bennet's reputation. She was convinced that had she held her tongue about the quiet whispers of what might have unfolded when he and the second eldest Bennet daughter were left alone behind closed doors, Darcy would have quit Hertfordshire the day after the ball, none the wiser. Instead, she had the misfortune of watching the man whom she coveted for herself, and the woman whose very essence disturbed her idea of what an accomplished young lady ought to be, join hands in matrimony. How vexing it was to know that her own actions, intended to bury the potential scandal, had been the means of uniting them. The haste in which Elizabeth had assumed her new appellation, Mrs. Fitzwilliam Darcy, was such that she often felt the need to pinch herself. She stood with Darcy in the mistress' suite at Darcy House. "I trust you find everything to your liking." "Indeed. Unless I am mistaken, there have been some changes since Georgiana showed me this room," said Elizabeth, observing all about. Every part of it was something with which she must now accustom herself. How different this room was from the one in which she had spent all her life in Hertfordshire, this exquisitely arranged room, which would be her own for evermore. "My sister and Mrs. Annesley were determined to adhere to all your mother's recommendations."
I had no idea they were taking Mamma's suggestions to heart. I must find a way to thank them properly when we are all together at Pemberley. Knowing that you are happy is all the thanks they require, I am sure. You are happy, are you not? I am, sir. It was such a beautiful ceremony. If I have but one regret, it is that Uncle and Aunt Gardner were unable to attend. Elizabeth wandered to the bedside table and studied the intricate pattern in the splendid silver candlestick holder. Her mind busily engaged in anxious thoughts of how different her life would be now that she was married to one of the wealthiest men in Derbyshire. How she would not wish to lose so much of herself in assuming the role as the wife of such a man, she spoke wistfully. I do hope we shall see my aunt and uncle while we are in London. Darcy had called on Elizabeth at the gardener's Cheapside home every day she was in town. He had been favourably impressed that despite Mr. Gardner being in trade, he was a sensible, gentlemanlike man, greatly superior to his sisters, Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, as much by nature as education. Not that it would have made any difference to him. By now, he fully embraced his friend Bingley's assertion that the Bennets might have uncles enough to fill all of Cheapside, and it would not make his lovely wife one jot less agreeable. Still, it was good to know that Mr. Gardner was nothing at all like his sisters. He said, "We shall make it a priority to call on them, Mrs. Darcy." How Darcy admired his bride. Everything about the wedding ceremony was perfect. Recalling how lovely she looked when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, he drifted behind her. Leaning forward, he brushed a kiss on the nape of her neck. Elizabeth jumped. Darcy stepped away. "I'm sorry." Elizabeth had merely been startled, but the look in her husband's eyes told her that he was severely wounded. She meant to apologize, but when she opened her mouth to speak, he held up his hand, effectively silencing her. His eyes regretful, he said, "I fear I may have overstepped. Forgive me. What on earth was I thinking? She must think me a savage, lustful and lascivious." He hesitated a moment, hoping she would absolve him of the discomfort he now felt. She did not. He cleared his throat. "It has been a long day. No doubt you are tired and in need of rest. I shall see you at dinner." He was gone directly. Unable to say whether humiliation or vexation bore the greater share of his attitude, he did not know what to think or how to feel. All he knew was he needed a stiff drink. On his way downstairs to his study, Darcy saw the butler. "Will you and Mrs. Darcy be dining in the formal dining parlour, sir, or would you prefer to dine elsewhere?" Here he cleared his throat. "Some place a bit quainter, perhaps." "The formal dining room," Darcy said, his voice reflecting a hint of his annoyance with himself for allowing his passions to get ahead of him in Elizabeth's apartment. His idea for an intimate dinner for two he abandoned. "The last thing I wish to do now is to overwhelm my bride." He had been most diligent in avoiding a repeat of what had happened that rainy day at Netherfield. Self-reliance had been a near constant companion of late. Such would surely be the case that night, his wedding night. She is young and innocent. She will need time to adjust to her new situation. I must abstain from such wild, carnal, unguarded behavior until she is ready. I will know when the time is right. I only pray I shall not have to wait too long. A while later, Darcy and Elizabeth reunited for dinner. Awkwardness flooded the room. Its companion, silence. Darcy sat at one end of the formal dining table best suited for a party of 20 or more, and Elizabeth sat far away at the opposite end. Any number of magnificent silver candelabras separated them, impeding any manner of polite conversation. Those times Elizabeth endeavoured to look around the ornate barriers and catch his eye, he seemed especially concerned with the delicate china, the sterling silver utensils, the sparkling crystal glasses, even the wall hangings. A host of servants stationed about the room gave Elizabeth to consider that a fitting explanation for Mr. Darcy's reserve. She certainly hoped such was the case, and that he was not nursing the wound she had unintentionally inflicted upon him earlier in her apartment. She tasted her soup. It was not too hot, not too cold, but rather just right. What was more, it was one of her favourites. She wondered if it were merely a coincidence, or if her husband had given himself the trouble to inform the cook of her preferences. Her instinct was to acknowledge his consideration, but that would have required yelling across the room. Albeit it was a lovely room, and she could well imagine all the delightful dinners she would oversee within those walls, it was far too formal for solely the two of them, far too formal for two young lovers on their wedding night. After dinner, Darcy prevailed upon Elizabeth to play something for him, and she gladly acceded to his request. He sat on the settee, and she sat at the pianoforte. He might have sat next to her, she thought, but then she considered he was brooding still over her inadvertent response to his amorous overture. How she wanted to explain, but in the absence of sufficient encouragement, she said nothing. Elizabeth yawned. The long day had taken its toll on her. "Pardon me, Mrs. Darcy. I fear I have been thoughtless in asking you to exhibit merely for my own pleasure. You must be thoroughly fatigued. Will you allow me to escort you to your room, so you might retire for the evening?" She half smiled. Perhaps he was not angry with her after all. She stood, and together they quit the room, arm in arm, and proceeded slowly up the stairs. Nary a word was exchanged, but Elizabeth liked to think that would be changed soon enough, thus erasing the strange sense of missing him that she suffered, even though he was standing right next to her. When they arrived at the door, he clasped her hand, raised it to his lips, and kissed it. "Good night, Mrs. Darcy." Wanting to put an end to the cool civility between them, she heard herself say, "Will you not be joining me, sir?" After what seemed a long time, but could not have been more than a second or two, he said, "I shall see you tomorrow, at breakfast." Releasing her hand and bowing slightly, Darcy went away. Elizabeth did not know what to think or how to feel. She drifted into her room. Seeing that her nightclothes, a silk negligee and matching robe, were placed on the bed, she rang for her maid. Were it not for the elaborate fastenings on her gown, she surmised she was more than capable of getting herself ready for bed. From the looks of things, that night would be no different from any other, except that she would be sleeping in a strange bed in a great big empty room. Looking around, she had never felt so alone as she felt at that moment. A half-hour later, Elizabeth sat up in bed in deep reflection of the prospects for her future happiness. What had happened to the man who had been so attentive to her during the days and weeks leading to the wedding? Had she caused him so much pain with her unintentional rebuff? Have I led him to believe that I do not welcome his affections? Is he regretting our hasty marriage? Elizabeth glanced in the direction of his apartment, and she detected a sliver of light peeking from underneath the door that she had not noticed before. Getting out of bed, she tiptoed across the room in her bare feet to listen. She remained there for at least a minute. No sound could be discerned. Then she heard a man's cough. She raced back to her bed. For half an hour she continued sitting up in bed, cradling her knees to her chest. This is not how I intended to spend the first night of my married life. She traced her fingers over her lips in remembrance of their first kiss as man and wife. It was pleasant enough, but it was not to be compared to their first kiss at Netherfield. That kiss had awakened her desires and left her longing for something more. Something so powerful, she likened her stirring passions whenever the two of them were alone to wantonness. She recalled her promise to herself that she would not give in to her yearnings no matter what, at least until after the wedding. She suspected Mr. Darcy's struggles were no less than her own,
as evidenced by his body's response whenever they were alone. Still, he had been a consummate gentleman in every respect since that rainy day at Netherfield. Save an incidental brush of their hand during the carriage ride to town, he had held himself in check. Now, when they were at liberty to explore their bodies beckoning, a misunderstanding had been the means of erecting a wall between them. The prelude to Mr. Darcy's marriage proposal echoed in her mind. I know what I am about to say to you might seem rather untoward, but decades from now, when you look back at this moment, my greatest wish is that you will remember it fondly.
Decades from now, when I reflect upon this night, should my memories not be even fonder? Elizabeth whispered.
Lifting her face to the ceiling, Elizabeth exhaled a determined breath.
Oh, it will not do.
She lowered her feet to the floor and reached for her silken robe.
Pray this is the only wedding night I shall ever have. I shall not allow a misunderstanding to intrude on the happiness of what is meant to be one of the most unforgettable days of my life.
Moments later, she slowly pushed open the door separating the two apartments. The blazing log fire cast a romantic air all about the room, warm and inviting. Elizabeth espied her husband sitting up in bed, his back cushioned against a mountain of fluffy pillows, reading a book. Darcy looked up. Seeing her in his room, he laid his book aside. His eyes questioning, he pushed away the covers and lowered his bare feet to the floor. The crisp linen nightshirt he wore evidenced his longing. Elizabeth felt the heat spread over her body. Her silk negligee left even less to the imagination. Her heartbeat raced. Answering his silent entreaty, she placed her fingers on her robe and lowered it from her shoulders. Inch by inch, it cascaded to the floor and puddled around her bare feet. He extended his hand to her. Elizabeth, my love. Reaching out to him, Elizabeth's fingers touched his. Darcy took her by the hand. He placed his free hand on her arm. Tenderly tracing a pattern towards her long, slender neckline, he welcomed her into his bed. Gently smoothing his hand under her chin, he lifted her face to his. Their eyes closed, their lips met. Slowly and reverently, at length they lay next to each other and commenced doing what lovers did. Hours later, Elizabeth awakened in Darcy's arms. All the promises inherent in their first kiss at Netherfield now fulfilled, she smiled. Their first night as man and wife was everything it was meant to be.
The first night of the rest of our lives, she reminded herself.
The host of candles all about having gone out by their own accord, the glowing embers in the fireplace barely lit the room. Taking care not to disturb his peaceful slumber, she brushed her fingers over Darcy's broad chest.
May each and every one of our nights together find me as blissfully contented as this.
This has been To Refuse Such a Man, a Pride and Prejudice variation, written by P.O. Dixon, narrated by Pearl Hewitt. Copyright 2015 by P.O. Dixon. Production copyright 2015 by P.O. Dixon.